Frank the Irishman Sheeran did not begin his life anywhere near organized crime, let alone the violent world he would eventually inhabit. His story begins in Depression-era Pennsylvania, where survival was hard, money was scarce, and the idea of a stable future felt distant. Born in 1920 in Derby, a working-class neighborhood near Philadelphia, Sheeran grew up in a tough Irish-American household that valued grit over gentleness. He was tall, physically imposing, and had the kind of quiet presence that made people pay attention without him saying much. Those traits, combined with a capacity for violence learned early in life, would shape the man he became. As a young boy, Frank learned that the world rewarded those who could stand their ground. Fistfights were common, discipline was strict, and life taught him that emotions were less useful than control. By the time he reached adulthood, the calmness in his voice hid a lifetime of suppressed aggression. But that same calmness also made him trusted, a trait the Mafia would later find valuable. His life took a sharper turn during World War II, where Sheeran served over 400 days of active combat, an experience that hardened him beyond understanding. While most soldiers rotated in and out of the front lines, Sheeran remained, fighting in some of the bloodiest campaigns across Italy. He often described the battlefield as a place where morality collapsed, where survival demanded a numbness to violence, and where the difference between mercy and efficiency blurred. He learned to follow orders without hesitation. He learned to kill without questioning, and most importantly, he learned how to detach himself emotionally from the act of killing. These years planted the seeds of what he would later call painting houses, a Mafia phrase meaning to kill a man at close range. The paint referred to blood splattering the walls. It was a dark joke spoken in hushed tones among hitmen, and Frank carried it with him long before ever met the men who would ask him to do it for real. After returning from the war, Sheeran married, had children, and worked long hours as a truck driver. But like many veterans, he struggled to adjust to civilian life. The adrenaline was gone. The sense of purpose was gone. The war had made him comfortable with things most men avoided, and that comfort became a quiet curse. Money was tight. Tempers were short, and Frank found himself drifting into the world of small-time crime. Nothing major at first. A favor here, a delivery there, a little work on the side, yet every step pulled him closer to the world that would define him. His entry into organized crime began almost accidentally. As a truck driver, he met a local mob-connected figure named Felix "Skinny Razor" DiTolia, the owner of a restaurant frequently visited by Philadelphia and New York mobsters. Razor liked Frank's toughness. He liked that Frank kept his mouth shut. Most importantly, he liked that Frank was both reliable and invisible, an ideal combination in a world where loyalty mattered more than blood. Frank started doing small jobs, collecting debts and helping enforce agreements. He had a soldier's discipline. He never asked questions, never complained, and never failed at a task. This earned him respect, not just in Philadelphia, but in the circles connected to the powerful Bufalino crime family of northeastern Pennsylvania. That was where he met Russell Bufalino, one of the most secretive, influential mob bosses in American history. Bufalino was not flashy like the New York Dons. He didn't draw attention, didn't crave headlines, and didn't carry himself like a movie mobster. Instead, he appeared quiet, thoughtful, almost gentle. But inside that quietness was a mind sharper than steel. Russell saw something in Frank instantly. He saw a man built by war and shaped by discipline, a perfect tool. Their friendship grew slowly but firmly. Russell introduced Frank to higher-level mob work, helping him secure jobs, money, and connections. Under Russell's guidance, Frank entered the world of labor unions, especially the Teamsters, a powerful organization filled with corruption, loyalty, and violence. Through the Teamsters, Frank met one of the most important figures in his life, Jimmy Hoffa, the legendary union leader. Hoffa was loud, bold, charismatic, and determined to build power at any cost. Frank admired him deeply, not just as a boss, but as a friend. Their bond became so strong that Frank would eventually call Hoffa one of the two greatest men I ever met, the other being Russell Bufalino. But Frank did not enter Hoffa's world as a regular ally. He entered as both helper and protector, a man who could be trusted with delicate and dangerous tasks. Hoffa relied on him. Russell relied on him. And Frank stood in the middle, loyal to both men, yet slowly being pulled into a storm he couldn't escape. By the mid-1950s, Frank Sheeran had evolved from a truck driver into a trusted Mafia associate. He was no longer just a man trying to support his family. He was becoming an enforcer, a negotiator, a fixer, a man known for his ability to paint houses when necessary. And that reputation would follow him for the rest of his life. But at the core of Frank's transformation was a quiet truth. He never saw himself as a monster. He saw himself as a soldier, someone who followed orders to maintain loyalty, power, and survival. He had no interest in fame, no desire for attention. He simply did what he believed needed to be done. This is the world Frank Sheeran stepped into, a world where friendship, betrayal sat side by side, where loyalty could be both noble and deadly, and where one man's choices would eventually shape one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in American history, the disappearance of Jimmy Hoffa. The journey was only beginning. One of Russell's favorite ways to judge a man was to watch how he behaved after being insulted. If someone snapped, raised their voice, or tried too hard to prove themselves, Russell considered them impulsive, dangerous, and the wrong way. Frank, however, stayed calm. He absorbed people's anger the same way he absorbed battlefield fire, quietly, steadily, and without letting emotion cloud his judgment. That calmness was rare. It made Russell trust him long before Frank even realized he was being examined. Their friendship grew in small, meaningful steps. Russell would invite Frank for coffee at roadside diners, places far from the glamour of mob life. There were no fancy suits, no limousines, no bragging mobsters. Just two men talking about life, work, and responsibility. But beneath the everyday conversations, Russell was slowly teaching Frank how his world worked. He explained the importance of loyalty, of finishing a job without discussion, and of never placing oneself above the organization. To Russell, ego was poison. Discipline was survival. Bit by bit, Russell pulled Frank into bigger responsibilities. A delivery here, a message there, an escort job for a visiting associate. Nothing dramatic at first, but each task was a lesson. Russell was watching how Frank moved, how he followed instructions, how he kept secrets. And Frank never disappointed. He didn't ask unnecessary questions, didn't boast, didn't panic. He simply completed each assignment with the same precision he had in the army. Russell liked that. He valued workers over talkers, soldiers over showmen. Through Russell, Frank met some of the most influential figures in organized crime. But what surprised Frank was how quietly powerful they were. There were no loud threats, no dramatic meetings like in the movies. Instead, Russell's circle consisted of calm men with calm faces, men who ran industries, unions, casinos, and territories without ever lifting their voices. Frank was stepping into a world where silence wasn't just a habit. It was strategy. One of Russell's most valuable qualities was his ability to appear insignificant. He didn't draw attention. He drove modest cars, wore simple clothes, and lived in a small, unremarkable house in Kingston, Pennsylvania. But from that small house, Russell orchestrated deals that stretched across states. He didn't need headlines, he needed stability. And his leadership style was built on staying invisible to the public while being unmistakably powerful to those who mattered. As Frank spent more time with Russell, he began to understand what true power looked like. It wasn't loud. It didn't advertise itself. True power was a man who could sit at a table, fold his hands, and make decisions that determined whether someone lived or died, and do it with the same calmness as ordering lunch. Russell didn't brag about his influence. He simply exercised it. One day, during a quiet drive through Pennsylvania's winding roads, Russell gave Frank one of the most important lessons of his life. He said, "You only do what's necessary. No more, no less." Frank never forgot that line. In Russell's world, excess was weakness. Violence was a tool, not an identity. Money was a means, not a trophy. Everything had a purpose, and everything had a limit. As months turned to years, Russell and Frank became almost inseparable. Their bond was unusual for the Mafia world. It wasn't just business. It was almost familial. Russell treated Frank like a trusted nephew, someone he could mold and rely on. And Frank, who had spent his life drifting between war, work, and uncertainty, found something in Russell that he had been missing for years: direction. This closeness led Frank deeper into the Bufalino family's operation. He helped settle disputes, enforce agreements, and maintain order when tempers flared between unions and business owners. He became the man Russell called when a delicate matter needed handling, whether it required negotiation or something more final. Frank's reputation grew quietly but steadily. People in the underworld began to recognize him as Russell's Irishman, a man whose loyalty was unquestionable and whose reliability was unmatched. But the most significant turn in Frank's life came when Russell introduced him to the Teamsters on a national level. Through Russell's connections, Frank stepped into the complex and lucrative world of labor unions, specifically the empire controlled by the legendary Jimmy Hoffa. Russell trusted Frank enough to place him in Hoffa's orbit, a decision that would change the course of American crime history. Yet even as Frank entered new arenas, Russell remained his compass. Whenever Frank faced a tough situation or moral conflict, it was Russell's calm voice he heard in his head. Russell's teachings were simple but powerful. Do your job, stay loyal, respect the chain of command, and never let emotions interfere with responsibility. Russell also taught Frank the most dangerous lesson of all, a lesson that would define the darkest moment of Frank's life many years later. Russell believed that loyalty was not about feelings, it was about obedience. If the organization required something, you did it, even if it meant breaking your own heart. Russell didn't phrase it that way, but that was the truth behind every quiet word he ever spoke. Their relationship grew so strong that Frank eventually considered Russell one of the two most important men he had ever known, not because Russell was powerful, but because he was steady, reliable, predictable, a man who guided with a firm hand and a calm voice. Frank had never met anyone like him before, and he would never meet anyone like him again. Over time, Russell became more than a mentor. He became the architect of Frank's entire underworld identity. If Frank ever struggled with a decision, he went to Russell. If Frank ever felt lost, Russell gave him direction. If Frank ever needed protection, Russell provided it. And in return, Frank offered unwavering loyalty that would eventually be tested in the most brutal way imaginable. But for now, in the early years, Frank was simply learning the rules, learning the discipline, learning the quiet power of a man who never raised his voice. Russell Bufalino was shaping him, piece by piece, into a figure who would stand at the center of one of America's greatest unsolved mysteries. And Frank followed him willingly, unaware that this loyalty would one day place him in a room where friendship, duty, and betrayal would collide in the most devastating way. Frank Sheeran's path into the Teamsters was not a planned career move. It happened naturally, almost quietly, the way most things in his life developed. One introduction led to another, one favor built on the previous one, and eventually Frank found himself standing inside one of the most powerful labor organizations in American history. And behind it all was Russell Bufalino, who had been pulling the strings, guiding Frank into a world far larger and far more complicated than the small jobs he had done before. To truly understand Frank's role in the Teamsters, you have to understand the Teamsters themselves. The International Brotherhood of Teamsters wasn't just a union. It was a national force. Millions of truck drivers, warehouse workers, shipping employees, and dock laborers spread across the entire country. Whoever controlled the Teamsters controlled the flow of goods, transportation, contracts, and the labor that kept entire industries running. It was power on a level few could imagine. And in the mid-20th century, that power rested almost entirely in the hands of one man, James Riddle Hoffa, better known to the world as Jimmy Hoffa. But before Frank met Hoffa, he had to understand the landscape he was stepping into. Russell explained it slowly, piece by piece, the same way a chess player teaches someone where each piece belongs before discussing actual strategy. The Teamsters were not a clean organization. There were alliances, rivalries, corrupt officials, business owners seeking influence, and Mafia families who saw the union as both an opportunity and a necessity. The Mafia didn't officially run the Teamsters, but their fingers were in every decision. Loans, contracts, election support, they all came with an understanding that loyalty flowed both ways. Frank learned quickly that his trucking background made him valuable. He wasn't just another outsider joining the union. He had lived the life of a driver. He understood long hours, hard work, unreasonable demands, and the constant pressure of delivery schedules. Men in the union respected him for that. He was one of them. And because Frank didn't come in bragging about connections or power, he blended naturally with the membership. He wasn't there to show off, he was there to work. Russell took him to meetings, gatherings, and backroom discussions where union business mixed with mob strategy. Frank would sit quietly, listening, absorbing the way the union leaders spoke. He learned about pension funds, health benefits, strikes, and negotiation. He learned how votes were secured, how loyalty was rewarded, and how dissent was handled. Most importantly, he learned how much the Mafia depended on the Teamsters' financial power. One of the most important moments came when Russell introduced Frank to a regional Teamsters organizer named Bill Bufalino, no relation to Russell, but a close ally. Bill was loud, confident, and politically sharp. He recognized immediately that Frank wasn't just another worker. He could sense Russell's influence behind him, and in the Teamsters world, having someone like Russell standing behind you opened doors that could remain closed for years for other men. Frank became useful very quickly. When union leaders needed a task handled quietly, Frank was the man who got the call. If there was a dispute between truckers and employers, Frank acted as a mediator. If someone threatened the union's interests, Frank was there to remind them of the rules. Sometimes that meant conversation, sometimes it meant something harsher. But Frank never failed. His calm voice and steady manner made him effective. People listened to him because he was trustworthy. And when words weren't enough, Frank's mere presence gave weight to the message. Within a short time, Frank's reputation grew beyond the local branches. Word spread that Russell's Irishman was someone who could be relied upon. He wasn't a talker. He wasn't a politician. He was a worker, solid, dependable, and unshakable. That reputation was strong enough that when the moment came for Frank to meet Jimmy Hoffa himself, the introduction felt almost natural. That meeting was set up by the Bufalino family during a union gathering. Hoffa was a man who could command a room instantly. He had a booming voice, sharp eyes, and a presence built on energy and confidence. If Russell was quiet power, Hoffa was loud authority. He clapped men on the back, shook hands firmly, and spoke with the certainty of someone who believed he could bend the world to his will, and for a time he really could. When Frank met Hoffa, the connection was immediate. Hoffa respected working men. He didn't care about race or background. He cared about loyalty and strength. When he learned Frank was a truck driver who had served in World War II, his respect grew even more. Hoffa admired men who had survived tough battles. He trusted men who understood hardship. Frank, with his calm demeanor and soldier's discipline, was the kind of man Hoffa liked to have at his side. Their first conversation wasn't dramatic. Hoffa simply asked Frank about his work, his family, and how he liked being in the Union. But Hoffa had a keen eye. He saw potential. He saw someone who could be both a protector and an enforcer, someone who could survive the political storms brewing inside the Teamsters, someone who could carry out delicate assignments without ever questioning the chain of command. Frank was struck by Hoffa's energy. He had never met anyone so passionate about a cause. Hoffa didn't just lead the Union, he lived it. He believed the Teamsters were the backbone of America. He believed workers deserved power. He believed loyalty was everything, and Frank respected that deeply. As weeks turned to months, Frank became more involved in Union operations. He traveled with officials, attended strategy sessions, and helped maintain order when disagreements escalated. The Teamsters relied on him more and more. Hoffa himself began requesting Frank by name for sensitive tasks, delivering messages, settling local disputes, and sometimes reminding certain businessmen that the Union wasn't to be underestimated. Frank wasn't just entering the Teamsters. He was becoming part of its inner structure. By this point, Frank was living a double identity. On the surface, he was a hard-working Union man, but beneath that surface, he was becoming a trusted figure within two worlds, the Teamsters and the Mafia. He understood that the two were intertwined. He understood that power wasn't simply given, it was negotiated through loyalty, fear, and trust. And slowly, Frank was shifting from being a follower to being someone others depended on. This rise would place him directly between the two most powerful figures in his life, Russell Bufalino and Jimmy Hoffa. At first, their worlds worked in harmony. But over time, the lines between loyalty and conflict began to blur, and Frank, standing in the middle, would find himself forced to choose between the two men he admired more than anyone. But that moment was still years away. For now, Frank was simply climbing higher into the Teamsters world, unaware that every step he took was leading him closer to an impossible decision, one that would define the rest of his life. Frank Sheeran always said that Jimmy Hoffa was unlike any man he had ever met. He wasn't like Russell Bufalino, whose quiet power flowed like an underground river, steady, hidden, and unstoppable. Hoffa was the opposite. He walked into a room like a thunderstorm, loud and electric, a force that reshaped the air around him. People listened because Hoffa made them listen. His energy was magnetic, raw, and fearless. In the world of labor unions, where power often came from intimidation, Hoffa dominated with charisma and an unshakable belief in himself. The first time Frank and Jimmy met face to face, it wasn't in some dark alley or secret mob meeting. It happened during a labor dispute where Frank had been sent to encourage certain drivers to keep their commitments to the Teamsters. Frank had been doing small jobs for Russell, quietly proving himself. But this assignment placed him under Hoffa's direct scrutiny. The moment Jimmy walked toward him, short, stocky, sleeves rolled up, marching with purpose, Frank knew this was a different kind of leader. Hoffa didn't introduce himself with titles or bragging. He simply stuck out his hand and said, "I hear you're a guy who gets things done." That was the beginning. Simple, direct, but meaningful. From that moment, the connection between the two men started to form in ways Frank couldn't have predicted. Hoffa liked Frank, immediately liked his calm demeanor, his soldiers' straightforwardness, his ability to follow orders without question. Hoffa relied on loyalty above all else, and Frank radiated loyalty. He wasn't flashy, didn't try to impress, didn't pretend to be something he wasn't. In a world full of loudmouths and opportunists, Frank's quiet presence was refreshing. Over time, Hoffa began using Frank more frequently. Not for hits, at least not at first, but for protection, organization, and enforcement. When Hoffa traveled, Frank traveled with him. When Hoffa met dangerous rivals, Frank stood nearby. When Hoffa needed someone he could trust, someone who wouldn't be bribed or intimidated, he called Frank. In a world where betrayal simmered in every corner, Hoffa felt strangely safe with the tall Irishman who never raised his voice and never asked for more than what he was given. Their bond strengthened through countless private conversations in hotel rooms, conference halls, and Teamster headquarters. Hoffa talked openly about the pressures of running the Union, the political battles he fought daily, and the constant threats from both government agencies and rival mob-backed factions. Frank listened not just with respect, but with genuine concern. Hoffa appreciated that. Most men pretended to listen, waiting for a chance to speak. Frank absorbed every word, every detail, every emotion. Hoffa loved to talk. Frank loved to listen. It was a perfect combination. As months turned into years, Frank became one of Hoffa's most trusted confidants. He handled delicate conflicts between competing locals, smoothed over union disputes before they exploded into violence, and protected Hoffa during public appearances. The Teamsters leader grew so comfortable with him that he often spoke to Frank the way a brother would, openly, honestly, and without filters. Jimmy Hoffa also admired Frank's war service. Many men in the Union claimed to be tough, but Frank carried a quiet toughness earned from real battlefields, not bar fights. Hoffa respected soldiers. He respected anyone who had suffered for something larger than themselves. To Hoffa, Frank wasn't just muscle. He was a man who understood sacrifice. Their friendship deepened outside of work as well. Hoffa loved simplicity. In his private life, barbecue dinners, card games, long conversations about the old days. Frank fit into that world with ease. He didn't gossip, didn't posture, didn't bring trouble. He was steady, the same steady that Russell saw in him. And Hoffa valued that steadiness even more because he lived in constant chaos. Hoffa would often joke with Frank, calling him my Irishman, a nickname said with warmth rather than ownership. Frank felt honored. Hoffa had charisma that made people feel seen, valued, chosen. It was a skill that helped him rise to national power, but also a skill that would eventually threaten the Mafia's patience. Frank didn't know it then, but Hoffa was already planting seeds of his own downfall. His refusal to bend, his refusal to back down, his refusal to let the Mafia push him aside. All of it slowly built a wall between Hoffa and the powerful men who once supported him. But in these earlier years, when alliances were still strong, Frank saw only the best of Hoffa. The dedication, the passion, the desire to fight for workers who had been ignored for decades. One evening, during a quiet moment after a long negotiation in Chicago, Hoffa spoke to Frank with unusual seriousness. They were sitting in a dimly lit room, coffee cups between them, the noise of the city muffled outside. Hoffa leaned forward, looked Frank in the eye, and said, "You don't trust many people in this life, Frank, but you I trust." Frank never forgot that. Those words carried weight, not the weight of danger, but the weight of responsibility. When Hoffa trusted you, he gave you a piece of himself, and Frank carried that piece with pride. But that trust came with a price. Hoffa began confiding in Frank about things he didn't share with other associates: his fear, his frustrations, his disagreements with the Mafia bosses who expected him to obey. Frank, stuck between two worlds, listened quietly, trying not to reveal that those same Mafia bosses were the people who had lifted him up. Russell Bufalino trusted Frank just as deeply, and Frank suddenly found himself becoming a bridge between two powerful men who were beginning to drift apart. Frank didn't choose sides, not yet, but he sensed the tension growing. Hoffa couldn't be controlled, not by anyone. He had a fire in him, a stubbornness that made him heroic to some and impossible to others. The Mafia preferred leaders who played by their rules, and Hoffa wasn't one of them. Still, in these early days, Frank saw only the good. Hoffa treated him with respect, honesty, and even affection. He wasn't just a boss, he was a friend. Someone Frank admired, someone he believed in, someone who stood up for workers when no one else did. Their bond became so strong that Frank would later describe Hoffa as one of the two greatest men I ever met. The other, of course, was Russell Bufalino. Frank didn't yet understand how impossible it would be to stay loyal to both men. He didn't understand that the bond he cherished with Hoffa would one day force him into a decision that would change his life forever. For now, he simply followed Hoffa, protected him, listened to him, and walked beside him as the Teamsters Union rose to its greatest height. Two worlds were forming around Frank, one ruled by quiet power, the other by explosive charisma, and Frank Sheeran stood firmly in the middle, unaware that loyalty would soon become the heaviest burden he had ever carried. By the late 1960s, Jimmy Hoffa had become a force unlike any the labor world had ever seen. He was charismatic, relentless, and feared by many who even whispered his name. Hoffa had an uncanny ability to rally workers and intimidate opponents at the same time. His influence stretched far beyond the Teamsters Union. Politicians sought his support, businesses dreaded his negotiations, and organized crime watched him carefully, sometimes with admiration, sometimes with suspicion. To them, Hoffa was both a potential ally and a dangerous loose cannon. Frank Sheeran, now deeply entrenched in both the Mafia and the Teamsters, watched the tension build firsthand. He had always known that his friendship with Hoffa was special, built on years of loyalty, protection, and shared secrets. But he also understood that Hoffa's refusal to bend to Mafia interests could put everyone in danger. Frank knew the rules of loyalty. The Mafia had its ways, its hierarchies, and its expectations. Hoffa, as brilliant and stubborn as he was, sometimes crossed the invisible lines that kept these two worlds balanced. Hoffa had made enemies early on by refusing to hand over union control to the Mafia. He demanded respect, money, and influence on his own terms. Many mobsters wanted to see him removed, believing that a compliant leader would be far easier to manage. Others recognized that Hoffa's power could serve their interests if he could be persuaded, manipulated, or controlled. Frank often found himself acting as the intermediary, trying to protect Hoffa, while also managing the expectations of the crime families that trusted him. This period was marked by meetings in smoke-filled rooms, quiet conversations in diners, and late-night phone calls where the tension was barely visible but omnipresent. Hoffa was fearless. He could intimidate bankers, businessmen, and mob associates alike, yet he trusted Frank implicitly. It was rare for someone so connected to the Mafia to have that level of trust in Hoffa, but Frank had earned it over years of unwavering loyalty. He became Hoffa's protector, negotiator, and confidant, the man who could calm volatile situations before they erupted. But loyalty in this world was never simple. Frank knew that Hoffa's stubbornness, while admirable, put both of them at risk. Mafia leaders quietly expressed frustration with Frank, hinting that Hoffa's defiance was a liability. They respected Frank enough to involve him in these discussions, subtly testing how far he would go to mediate between Hoffa's ego and their expectations. Every meeting was a delicate balance. Protect Hoffa, keep the Mafia satisfied, and maintain Frank's own position as the trusted enforcer who walked the line between loyalty and survival. The tension escalated further when Hoffa attempted to reclaim full control of the Teamsters. After serving his time in prison, many mob leaders had already positioned themselves to influence the union, and Hoffa's return threatened to upend their plans. Frank witnessed firsthand the quiet panic this caused among Mafia bosses, who had grown used to a more manageable union under their influence. For Hoffa, this was about power and legacy. For the Mafia, it was about control, protection, and profit. Frank was caught in the middle of a storm he could neither stop nor ignore. He understood the stakes. Hoffa's ambition and stubbornness could spark conflict with men who had far more patience and far less tolerance for insubordination than anyone outside the Mafia could imagine. Yet Frank's loyalty prevented him from stepping away. He had pledged to protect Hoffa, to serve him as faithfully as he had served Russell Bufalina. That loyalty demanded not just courage, but also strategy, calculation, and the ability to navigate one of the most dangerous webs of power in American history. Violence, while not constant, was always a threat. Frank remembered the coded conversations, the warnings delivered in subtle ways, an unexpected call, a gesture during a handshake, a quiet word at a private dinner. Everything was measured, everything deliberate. The Mafia rarely threatened openly. Their power was quiet, yet absolute. Frank understood that any misstep, any perceived betrayal, could have irreversible consequences. He had learned to read the signs, to anticipate danger, and to act swiftly if the situation required it. At the same time, Frank recognized Hoffa's genius. The man had an ability to inspire loyalty unlike anyone else. People were drawn to him, willing to risk their livelihoods for his vision. But that vision clashed with the Mafia's expectations of obedience and control. Hoffa wanted independence, and the Mafia wanted compliance. Frank was the bridge, and that role weighed heavily on him. Every decision he made could tip the balance between survival and disaster. As the months passed, the tension between Hoffa and the Mafia became almost tangible. Meetings grew more intense, negotiations more delicate, and threats more subtle. Frank found himself increasingly burdened by knowledge that loyalty alone might not be enough to prevent catastrophe. He understood that Hoffa's charisma, boldness, and defiance could provoke a reaction that neither Frank nor Hoffa could control. And yet, he continued to serve, continuing to mediate, warn, and sometimes act as the silent enforcer behind closed doors. The inevitable clash loomed over them all. Hoffa's ambition to regain full control of the Teamsters, his refusal to yield to Mafia influence, and the growing impatience of crime leaders created a volatile mixture. Frank knew that this tension could explode at any moment. And though he had grown accustomed to danger, this felt different. This was no longer about small disputes, minor threats, or territorial disagreements. This was about life, death, and the fragile balance between loyalty and survival in a world ruled by silence, subtlety, and deadly precision. Frank's role as mediator, protector, and enforcer had never been more critical. Every meeting he attended, every word he spoke, and every silent action he took carried enormous weight. The stakes could not have been higher. Hoffa versus the Mafia was no longer a metaphor, it was a ticking clock, with Frank standing at the center, trying to maintain peace, while knowing that any misstep could lead to irreversible consequences. In this tense environment, Frank realized a truth that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Loyalty in the Mafia world was absolute. but it was also conditional. Protecting a friend like Hoffa was possible only as long as that protection did not threaten the delicate balance of power. One wrong move, one misinterpreted action, and years of loyalty could be erased in an instant. And for Frank Sheeran, the quiet enforcer, that understanding would guide his decisions in the dark days to come, as the clash between Hoffa and the Mafia reached its inevitable, tragic conclusion. In the world Frank Sheeran inhabited, violence was never personal. It was a transaction, a duty, and at times, an art form. By the time he received his first serious assignment, he understood that the phrase painting houses was no metaphor. It was a code, a warning, and a skill, all rolled into one. The Mafia called it that because of the inevitable result, walls splattered with blood, as if someone had painted them. For Frank, it was a horrifying concept spoken in calm, almost clinical tones, by men he trusted. And yet, when the moment came, it was his discipline, his training, and his emotional detachment that carried him through. Frank's introduction to the act was not sudden or reckless. Russell Bufalino had prepared him slowly, deliberately. It began with conversations about loyalty, obedience, and consequences. He spoke of responsibility, of the necessity of action when the family demanded it, and of the cold precision required to survive in a world where hesitation could be fatal. Frank listened carefully, internalizing every word. The true lesson was not about brutality itself, it was about control. Violence was a tool, and he had to wield it without fear, without hesitation, and without remorse. The first assignment came in the mid-1960s. Frank was instructed to travel to a rural property, where a man who had crossed the family was staying. Details were scarce part of the Mafia's protocol. Frank was told to arrive quietly, wait for a signal, and act when necessary. There was no room for error, no second chances. He drove the truck along back roads, heart steady, mind focused. Each mile felt both ordinary and surreal, as if he were preparing to walk into another world entirely. A world in which the rules of morality did not apply, and the only currency was obedience. Upon arrival, Frank observed the house carefully. The target was unaware of his presence, a fact that made the task both simpler and heavier. He carried the weight of responsibility like a soldier on patrol, understanding fully that this was not just a job, it was a defining moment in his life. Every movement had to be precise, every decision calculated. Those moments, Frank's wartime experience proved invaluable. The patience, observation, and focus he had honed on the battlefields of Italy were now applied to a completely different kind of mission. When the moment came, Frank acted. There was no hesitation. The act was swift, exact, and carried out with a professionalism that would later become his hallmark. He reflected afterward, not on the morality of his actions, but on the efficiency. The job was completed, the target neutralized, and the painting done as the family expected. It was a cold, controlled process, and Frank recognized that this was the path he had chosen. There was no glory, no celebration, only the quiet acknowledgement that duty had been fulfilled. Afterward, Frank was left alone with his thoughts. A common ritual for men in his position. He knew that once a person committed an act of violence at this level, line between life and death, loyalty and betrayal, was permanently altered. He had crossed the threshold. The world he had entered was no longer abstract. It was real, tangible, and irreversible. The feeling was not of exhilaration or satisfaction, but of solemn understanding. In this world, every action had a consequence, and Frank had just taken one that could never be undone. Russell Bufalino, ever the careful mentor, debriefed him afterward. There was no judgment, no unnecessary discussion, just a calm evaluation of Frank's approach, his composure, and his effectiveness. Russell emphasized the importance of discretion, of never discussing the act with anyone outside the immediate chain of command. In the Mafia, secrecy was as important as the action itself. Frank absorbed every detail, knowing that any lapse in judgment could end not just his career, but his life. This first act of violence had a profound effect on Frank, shaping his understanding of loyalty, obedience, and morality in the criminal world. He realized that in the Mafia, personal feelings were irrelevant. Success was measured by execution, reliability, and discretion. Every decision had a cost, and the line between right and wrong was defined not by conscience, but by the expectations of the family. Frank began to understand that he was no longer merely a truck driver, a soldier, or a loyal friend. He had become a tool, a weapon, and an enforcer all at once. Over the following months, Frank's skills were honed further. He learned to approach assignments with meticulous planning, anticipating obstacles and mitigating risk. He practiced restraint, knowing that overzealous action could compromise the mission. He internalized the cold logic of his world, that life and death were sometimes the same transaction, and that loyalty demanded sacrifices few could imagine. With each job, his reputation grew quietly, and the name Frank Sheeran became synonymous with precision, reliability, and discretion within the Mafia. Despite the gravity of his actions, Frank retained a sense of humanity. He did not take pleasure in violence. He did not seek notoriety or admiration. He approached each assignment with the same calm determination he had learned in war: detached, disciplined, and focused. This balance between professional detachment and personal morality became his survival mechanism. It allowed him to navigate the treacherous waters of organized crime while maintaining his own sense of identity, however tenuous that identity might have become. It was during these years that the phrase painting houses became more than just slang. It became a symbol of Frank's dual existence. On one side was the man devoted to family, friends, and loyalty. On the other was the enforcer, the executor, the man capable of acts few could comprehend. Frank understood that living in both worlds simultaneously required compartmentalization, emotional control, and an unbreakable adherence to the rules set by men like Russell Bufalino. Looking back, Frank would later describe this period as the most transformative of his life. It was a time when duty eclipsed personal morality, when loyalty demanded acts that would forever haunt a man's conscience, and when survival depended on mastering the balance between action and discretion. The first painting house's job was more than an introduction to organized crime. It was the defining moment that shaped Frank Sheeran into the man history would remember, the man who could carry out the most dangerous assignments with unwavering loyalty and deadly precision. In the quiet hours after the job, Frank reflected on what he had become. The world had changed him, molded him into a figure who could navigate both loyalty and betrayal, friendship and obligation, life and death. And while he had no desire for fame, he understood that the choices he made from this point forward would define not only his own destiny, but the fate of those around him, especially the men he had vowed to protect, men like Jimmy Hoffa. And so, with the first house painted, Frank Sheeran fully stepped into the world he would inhabit for decades, a world of loyalty, violence, discretion, and relentless responsibility. A world where every action had meaning, every silence carried weight, and every decision could be the difference between survival and death. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, Frank Sheeran's world had expanded far beyond the quiet neighborhoods of Pennsylvania and the shadowed back rooms of the Mafia. Through his loyalty to Russell Bufalino and his friendship with Jimmy Hoffa, Frank had become a bridge between organized crime and the highest levels of political influence in America. The Mafia was no longer just a network of local power, it had national reach, and through strategic relationships, it could manipulate unions, businesses, and even government officials. Frank, once a soldier and enforcer, had now become a key figure in a system that blended crime with legitimate power, where politics and corruption were inseparable. Hoffa was central to the expansion of influence. As the head of the Teamsters, he controlled one of the most powerful unions in the United States, with tens of thousands of members, billions of dollars in pension funds, and significant leverage in industries from trucking to construction. The Teamsters were more than a labor union. They were a tool for shaping policy, influencing elections, and controlling major business decisions. Frank witnessed firsthand how Hoffa navigated this complex world, bold, audacious, and unafraid to challenge both corporate and criminal powers alike. Frank's role in this system was unique. Unlike most enforcers who remained behind the scenes, he often moved between worlds, attending meetings with union officials, negotiating with business leaders, and ensuring that Hoffa's directives were carried out without interference. His reputation for discretion and loyalty made him invaluable. He could be present in political discussions without raising suspicion, and yet he was also capable of carrying out the more dangerous tasks that the union's leadership required. In many ways, Frank had become the silent hand guiding events from the shadows. The connection between the Mafia and politics was subtle but undeniable. Through labor unions like the Teamsters, the Mafia had access to campaigns, politicians, and industry leaders. Hoffa's ability to sway votes and mobilize workers made him a powerful ally or a dangerous adversary. Frank often accompanied Hoffa on trips to Washington, D.C. and other political centers, observing firsthand how power was wielded behind closed doors. Meetings with senators, representatives, and lobbyists often included subtle nods to the influence of organized crime. Deals were brokered quietly, favors exchanged, and alliances formed without any public acknowledgement. Frank understood that this was a high-stakes game. One misstep could trigger investigations, scandals, or even violence. But the rewards were immense. Control over pension, contracts, and industries meant money, power, and leverage that few outside this circle could imagine. Frank's ability to navigate these spaces required the same precision he had once used in painting houses. Every word mattered. Every gesture had meaning. Loyalty, discretion, and timing were as crucial in these political arenas as they were in the most dangerous mafia operations. Russell Bufalino remained Frank's mentor throughout this period, guiding him through the intricate web of influence that connected crime to politics. Russell was careful, calculating, and patient. He advised Frank on how to observe without interfering, how to negotiate without committing, and how to anticipate threats before they became crises. Russell's teachings emphasized long-term strategy. While violence was necessary in certain situations, the true power lay in control over institutions, the ability to manipulate systems, and the patience to wait for the right moment to act. Frank saw how Hoffa's ambitions created both opportunities and dangers. Hoffa wanted independence, power, and recognition for his union. The Mafia wanted stability, profit, and loyalty. Frank's role was to ensure that Hoffa's boldness did not destabilize the delicate balance between these competing forces. This meant mediating conflicts, delivering warnings discreetly, and sometimes performing tasks that were morally ambiguous, but essential for maintaining equilibrium. It was a constant balancing act, one that required nerves of steel, careful judgment, and unwavering focus. The pension funds controlled by the Teamsters were another avenue through which Frank witnessed the intersection of crime and politics. These funds represented billions of dollars and were a source of influence that extended far beyond the union itself. Hoffa's leadership ensured that the funds could be used strategically, including investments that benefited both union members and organized crime interests. Frank was often present during discussions about these investments, observing how the right alliances could transform influence into power. These experiences taught him that true control was not always about overt action. It was about positioning, leverage, and quiet authority. Despite the seeming glamour of political connections, Frank never lost sight of the dangers. Every decision was a potential threat. Every ally could become an enemy. He observed how quickly fortunes changed, how quickly loyalty could erode, and how one wrong word could trigger investigations or violence. The stakes were enormous, and the consequences unforgiving. Frank's military discipline, combined with his understanding of human behavior and Mafia protocol, allowed him to navigate these dangers with precision. By now, Frank had become indispensable to both Russell Bufalino and Jimmy Hoffa. He was trusted with sensitive negotiations, strategic guidance, and even the execution of difficult tasks that required discretion and skill. He had moved beyond the role of simple enforcer. He was now a strategist, mediator, and silent guardian of a fragile network of power that spanned local, national, and political spheres. His influence was invisible to the public eye, yet it shaped events that affected thousands of lives. As Frank reflected on this period later in life, he recognized how rare it was to operate at this intersection of crime, politics, and labor. Most people never saw the connections between unions, organized crime, and government, but Frank lived within it daily. He understood that his loyalty, discipline, and ability to act without hesitation were what allowed him to survive and thrive in a world where power was fragile and every move had consequences. Ultimately, Frank's experiences during this period reinforced lessons he had learned throughout his life. Loyalty is paramount, discretion is essential, and true power is often invisible. While others sought recognition, glory, or fame, Frank found purpose in quiet, competence, and silent execution. It was a mindset that would define him for the rest of his life, particularly as the tensions surrounding Hoffa ambitions escalated to the point where decisions would need to be made that no man could take lightly. Frank's role in the political and national power landscape of the 1970s exemplified the subtle, complex, and dangerous world of organized crime. It was a world in which influence, money, and loyalty intersected, and where the choices of a single man could tip the balance between stability and chaos. And at the center of it all, Frank Sheeran remained the calm, disciplined enforcer who understood that survival, loyalty, and precision were the ultimate currencies in a life defined by both power and danger. The world around Jimmy Hoffa was shifting, and Frank Sheeran knew that every move, every decision, had consequences that could last a lifetime. By the early 1970s, Hoffa's legal battles had culminated in a prison sentence, sending shockwaves through the Teamsters and leaving the union's future uncertain. For Frank, the prison years were a test unlike any he had faced before. It was no longer about navigating the delicate balance between loyalty and influence from the outside now. He was thrust into a confined, volatile world where every word and action mattered, where survival depended on instinct, and where allegiances were constantly tested. Hoffa's imprisonment was a dramatic event, not just legally, but culturally. He had been a public figure, a man whose power extended far beyond union halls into boardrooms and government offices. His absence left a vacuum that rivals and allies alike were eager to fill. Frank knew that maintaining the fragile network of loyalty and influence required careful planning. He became a constant presence in Hoffa's life, even within the walls of the penitentiary, acting as both protector and emissary for the outside world. His role shifted from enforcer to strategist, ensuring that Hoffa remained connected, respected, and aware of the political and criminal dynamics surrounding him. The prison environment was unforgiving. Frank witnessed firsthand the brutal realities of incarceration, where survival required not only physical strength but also psychological acuity. He observed rivalries that mirrored the streets, the silent rules that governed conduct, and the subtle ways influence and respect were maintained behind bars. Even in prison, power was currency, and Frank learned that it could be wielded quietly and effectively without violence. Although the threat of it was never far from the surface, Hoffa, even behind bars, remained larger than life. He commanded attention in the yard, in the dining halls, and even in meetings with officials. But his legal battles, combined with the isolation of prison life, tested his resilience. Frank acted as an extension of Hoffa's authority, a trusted confidant who could manage delicate situations and maintain communication with loyal allies on the outside. He had to ensure that Hoffa's directives were respected and that no rival factions could undermine his influence. It was a role that required patience, vigilance, and constant attention to detail. During these years, Frank also observed how imprisonment affected the hierarchy of power within the Teamsters. Certain members saw Hoffa's absence as an opportunity to consolidate influence, while others remained fiercely loyal, waiting for his return. Frank's presence provided stability. He was a familiar face, a conduit for Hoffa's instruction, and a symbol of continuity for those who still believed in Hoffa's leadership. His loyalty became a stabilizing force in a time of uncertainty, highlighting the critical role that trust and discretion played in maintaining power within both the union and the criminal network surrounding it. Frank's own role in prison extended beyond mere loyalty. He became an intermediary, communicating sensitive information between Hoffa and external allies, negotiating disputes, and ensuring that potential conflicts were diffused before they escalated. He applied the same strategic thinking he had learned from Russell Bufalino: patience, observation, and the careful measurement of risk. Every interaction had a purpose, and every decision carried weight, as even minor missteps could have significant consequences in a world where reputation and respect were everything. Despite the structure and routine of prison life, the constant threat of violence lingered. Frank recognized that danger was never far away, and he remained vigilant at all times. He watched for signs of betrayal, assessed potential threats, and intervened quietly when necessary. The prison environment tested not only his physical strength, but also his ability to remain calm under pressure, a skill honed from years of military service, Mafia operations, and his work with Hoffa. He had learned that subtle influence often carried more weight than overt aggression, and he relied on this principle constantly. Frank also saw how imprisonment affected Hoffa personally. The isolation, the constant scrutiny, and the legal uncertainty wore on him, and Frank's presence became a source of support. He listened, advised, and acted as a buffer between Hoffa and the pressures of the outside world. It was a delicate balance. He had to protect Hoffa's interests without overstepping his own role, and he had to maintain the trust of the Union, the Mafia, and Hoffa himself. Every decision required precision, discretion, and an understanding of human behavior that few possessed. During this period, Frank's awareness of the broader implications of organized crime and union politics deepened. He realized that the Mafia's influence was not limited to violence. It extended into financial systems, political structures, and social hierarchies. Hoffa's imprisonment highlighted the fragility of power, showing how quickly fortunes could change and how easily influence could be disrupted. Frank's role as mediator, enforcer, and strategist became even more critical as he navigated these complex dynamics, ensuring that loyalty and order were maintained despite the pressures of incarceration. The prison years also shaped Frank's understanding of loyalty, morality, and the cost of obedience. He had seen violence, corruption, and betrayal, but in this confined world the stakes were more immediate and personal. Survival depended not only on action, but also on perception, reputation, and the careful management of relationships. Frank's experiences reinforced lessons he had learned from Russell Bufalino and from his time in the Mafia. Discretion, patience, and loyalty were paramount, and even the most calculated actions carried consequences that could ripple far beyond immediate events. By the time Hoffa was released, Frank had become indispensable. His presence had preserved Hoffa's influence, maintained the respect of union members, and kept potential rivals in check. Frank had operated silently, strategically, and effectively, ensuring that the balance of power remained intact during one of the most critical periods in Hoffa's life. The prison years tested his skills, his loyalty, and his judgment in ways that no battlefield or Mafia assignment had, and he emerged with a deeper understanding of the intricate interplay between power, loyalty, and survival. These experiences would later inform Frank's perspective on the disappearance of Jimmy Hoffa and the decisions that followed. He had seen firsthand how quickly power could shift, how loyalty could be strained, and how the consequences of action or inaction could shape history. The prison years were not just a chapter in Hoffa's story, they were a defining period in Frank Sheeran's life, shaping him into the man who could navigate the dangerous intersection of union leadership, organized crime, and political influence with unmatched skill and unwavering loyalty. Through it all, Frank remained calm, disciplined, and focused. He understood that loyalty demanded sacrifice, discretion required vigilance, and survival required constant awareness. The lessons he learned during Hoffa's prison years would guide him in the years to come, preparing him for the events that would forever cement his place in the history of organized crime and American labor. When Jimmy Hoffa walked out of prison, the world he returned to was both familiar and dramatically changed. The Teamsters union, once under his firm command, had shifted. Political alliances were different. Rival factions had emerged, and the subtle influence of the Mafia over the union had grown stronger during his absence. For Frank Sheeran, the years of loyalty, protection, and strategic mediation had kept Hoffa's power intact, but the challenges now were more complex. It was no longer just about safeguarding Hoffa from immediate threats. It was about navigating a new landscape of power, loyalty, and ambition where one wrong move could have devastating consequences. Hoffa returned with a singular focus, reclaimed control. He had been absent, but his vision for the union, for labor, and for influence had never diminished. He was determined to reassert authority, rebuild alliances, and confront anyone who had attempted to manipulate his absence for personal gain. Frank observed Hoffa carefully during these first months, understanding the intensity of his ambition and the determination that had made him such a formidable leader. Hoffa's charisma was intact, but the world around him had grown more dangerous. Allies and enemies alike were watching his every move, and Frank understood that the line between trust and betrayal had never been thinner. Frank's role became more crucial than ever. He was no longer just a protector or mediator, he was a strategist, operating at the intersection of loyalty, influence, and danger. Every meeting with union officials, every negotiation with business leaders, and every interaction with political figures required careful calculation. Frank had to anticipate threats, assess motives, and sometimes intervene before tensions escalated. His experience from both the Mafia and Hoffa's prison years had honed his ability to navigate these complex dynamics with precision and discretion. The Mafia, meanwhile, was both an ally and a silent observer. Hoffa's return threatened the balance they had established in his absence. Certain factions within the criminal network viewed his ambition with suspicion. They understood that Hoffa's drive to regain complete control of the Teamsters could disrupt established agreements, challenge their influence, and create instability in operations that relied on union control. Frank, trusted by both Hoffa and the Mafia, became the intermediary who could quietly manage this tension. He ensured that communication remained open, conflicts were addressed discreetly, and the fragile equilibrium was maintained. Despite the careful management, the world post-prison was fraught with danger. Hoffa's enemies, both within the union and in organized crime, were watching for weaknesses. Rival leaders sought opportunities to undermine him, while law enforcement agencies monitored his every action. Frank understood that survival in this environment required more than loyalty. It required vigilance, foresight, and the ability to act decisively when circumstances demanded. He became Hoffa's silent anchor, the man who could move between rooms, conversations, and factions without drawing attention, yet whose presence ensured that order was preserved. Hoffa's ambition brought him into contact with national political figures once again. Campaigns, endorsements, and labor negotiations became arenas in which influence and power were constantly tested. Frank often accompanied Hoffa on these trips, observing interactions, identifying potential threats, and providing guidance when necessary. His military training, Mafia experience, and understanding of human behavior made him uniquely suited to operate in these environments. He had learned to anticipate reactions, read intentions, and act with a level of calm detachment that few could match. The world had also changed technologically and socially. New media coverage, investigative journalism, and increased public scrutiny meant that Hoffa's actions were no longer shielded from the spotlight. Every decision could be dissected, every misstep amplified. Frank recognized that maintaining discretion was more important than ever. He carefully managed communications, advised Hoffa on sensitive matters, and acted as a buffer between the union leader and external pressures. The stakes were higher, the risks more visible, and the consequences of failure potentially catastrophic. Within the Teamsters, Frank observed the subtle shifts in loyalty. Certain members had grown accustomed to operating without Hoffa's oversight, forming factions and alliances that could challenge his authority. Frank's presence served as both a reminder of continuity and a stabilizing force. He quietly monitored activities, reported potential threats, and ensured that Hoffa's directives were respected. His role was delicate. Too much influence could create suspicion, too little could allow rivals to gain power. Every action required careful balance, discretion, and timing. The Mafia's oversight was constant but measured. They understood that Hoffa's return was both a potential opportunity and a risk. Frank's unique position allowed him to convey concerns, provide reassurance, and act as a negotiator when tensions threatened to escalate. He maintained loyalty to both Hoffa and Russell Bufalino, ensuring that neither side felt undermined. This balancing act was mentally and emotionally demanding, requiring constant vigilance and unwavering focus. Frank had learned to compartmentalize his responsibilities, maintaining clarity and precision, even in the face of complex and dangerous situations. Financial influence also played a critical role in the post-prison era. Hoffa's control over union funds, pensions, and contracts provided leverage that extended far beyond labor negotiations. Frank observed how these resources could be used strategically to secure loyalty, influence elections, and support business interests. His understanding of the broader implications of these financial moves allowed him to advise and protect Hoffa in subtle, impactful ways. The management of money, power, and loyalty became intertwined, creating a web of influence that Frank navigated with care. Yet, despite the outward appearance of control, Frank knew the situation was fragile. Hoffa's enemies were patient, observant, and ruthless. Any miscalculation could lead to violent retribution, legal challenges, or the destabilization of decades of influence. Frank's experience had taught him that loyalty and action were inseparable from awareness and strategy. He had to anticipate not only the immediate consequences of decisions but also the long-term ramifications for Hoffa, the Teamsters, and the Mafia. The post-prison years reinforced Frank's understanding of power, loyalty, and discretion. He had seen the consequences of ambition, the fragility of influence, and the constant interplay between personal loyalty and institutional control. Frank's role had evolved into one of unparalleled responsibility. He was the silent guardian of Hoffa's authority, the intermediary between competing factions, and the enforcer of stability in a world where trust was rare and danger was ever present. Ultimately, the world after Hoffa's release was a test of endurance, intelligence, and loyalty. Frank Sheeran navigated this landscape with the same precision and calm detachment that had defined his life as a soldier and enforcer. He understood that survival depended not only on action, but on judgment, discretion, and an unwavering commitment to the men and institutions he served. These years would lay the groundwork for the choices, challenges, and tragedy that defined the next chapter of his life and of American labor history itself. As the 1970s progressed, the world surrounding Jimmy Hoffa became increasingly volatile, and Frank Sheeran found himself at the center of rising tensions that threatened both the Union and the Mafia's carefully maintained balance. Hoffa's ambitions to regain absolute control of the Teamsters collided with the interests of organized crime, rival union officials, and government investigators. Frank, ever the silent guardian, watched these dynamics unfold with a mix of caution and calculation, understanding that the stakes had grown higher than ever before. Hoffa's determination to assert his authority was unyielding. He believed in his ability to unify the Union, reclaim lost influence, and challenge those who had attempted to manipulate his absence. But the world had changed, and old alliances were no longer guaranteed. Certain figures within the Mafia had grown accustomed to a level of control over the Union, and Hoffa's return threatened to disrupt their operations. These tensions simmered quietly, manifesting in subtle warnings, coded messages, and behind-the-scenes negotiations that few outside the inner circle could understand. Frank's role became increasingly complex. He was not just a protector, he was a mediator, a negotiator, and a strategist. He had to anticipate potential conflicts before they arose, assess the intention of both allies and adversaries, and intervene discreetly to maintain balance. Every conversation, every meeting, and every decision required precision. One misstep could ignite violence, spark a scandal, or destabilize the delicate equilibrium that had been painstakingly maintained over decades. Frank understood that his actions or inaction carried consequences far beyond his personal survival. The Mafia's patience was tested as Hoffa pressed forward. Leaders like Russell Bufalino understood Hoffa's brilliance but also recognized his stubbornness and the threat it posed to the established order. Frank became the intermediary between these two worlds, delivering warnings with subtlety, managing Hoffa's expectations, and ensuring that negotiations did not devolve into conflict. His presence was indispensable because he earned the trust of both sides, a trust rooted in years of proven loyalty, discretion, and competence. Government scrutiny added another layer of tension. Law enforcement agencies were increasingly investigating the Teamsters, Hoffa's connections, and the influence of organized crime. Frank observed the delicate balance Hoffa had to maintain, projecting authority and control while navigating legal pressure that could quickly unravel the union's power structure. Frank's role extended to providing strategic guidance, protecting sensitive information, and acting as the bridge between Hoffa and the outside world. His awareness of risk and his ability to act with calculated precision became crucial in maintaining both Hoffa's position and his personal safety. Within the Union, rival factions sensed opportunity. Certain officials sought to consolidate power during Hoffa's return, testing loyalties and seeking ways to advance their own interests. Frank quietly monitored these factions, assessing intentions and identifying potential threats. He intervened when necessary, often without being noticed, to ensure that Hoffa's authority remained intact. His interventions were subtle, surgical in nature, and designed to prevent escalation. He understood that overt displays of power could provoke backlash, while inaction could embolden adversaries. Violence, while not constant, remained a latent threat. Frank had seen the consequences of miscalculated aggression, and he approached potential conflicts with caution and precision. He knew that the Mafia's methods were patient and relentless, and that retaliation for perceived disrespect or obstruction could be swift and unforgiving. Every action had to be measured, every alliance carefully maintained, and every negotiation conducted with awareness of both immediate and long-term consequences. Frank's discipline and experience allowed him to navigate this dangerous landscape with effectiveness that few could match. Personal loyalty also weighed heavily on Frank during this period. His bond with Hoffa was forged over years of shared history, trust, and mutual reliance. Yet, loyalty in this world demanded difficult choices, often requiring the prioritization of the organization over personal attachment. Frank understood the harsh realities of his role, sometimes protecting. Hoffa required actions that could be morally ambiguous, painful, or irreversible. He reconciled these realities with the knowledge that survival, influence, and stability were paramount in the high-stakes environment they inhabited. As tensions escalated, Frank began to sense the fragility of the world they operated within. The Mafia, the Union, and the political landscape were interconnected in a web of influence, ambition, and hidden threats. Hoffa's assertiveness challenged the status quo, creating friction that could easily escalate into conflict. Frank's strategic thinking became essential in managing this friction. He employed patience, observation, and subtle persuasion to keep potential crises in check. His ability to anticipate reactions and navigate complex social dynamics was critical to preventing situations from spiraling out of control. Every meeting and interaction carried weight. Frank observed negotiations, assessed rivalries, and monitored both overt and hidden threats. He maintained open lines of communication with trusted allies while ensuring that sensitive information did not fall into the wrong hands. His discretion was his greatest asset. The ability to act decisively without drawing attention allowed him to maintain authority in situations where visibility could be dangerous. Frank's presence was often invisible to those outside the inner circle, yet his influence shaped outcomes at every level. The rising tensions of this period foreshadowed the dramatic events that would soon engulf Hoffa and the Teamsters. Frank recognized that the convergence of ambition, loyalty, and danger created a situation in which every choice carried consequences that could reverberate for years. His role required constant vigilance, strategic thinking, and unwavering commitment. He understood that the fragile balance they maintained could be disrupted at any moment, and that preparedness, discretion, and loyalty were the only means of survival. Through it all, Frank remained disciplined, calm, and focused. He navigated the intersection of loyalty, power, and danger with a precision honed through years of military service, mafia operations, and his close relationship with Hoffa. He understood that the world they operated within demanded both patience and decisiveness, subtlety and strength. Every move, every decision, and every conversation was measured against the potential for immediate and long-term consequences. By the end of this period, Frank had solidified his position as an indispensable figure in Hoffa's world. His role as protector, strategist, and mediator had been tested and proven. He had navigated complex threats, maintained loyalty, and ensured stability in a volatile environment. Yet, the rising tensions and growing threats served as a constant reminder that their world was precarious, fragile, and unpredictable. Frank understood that the coming years would demand even greater focus, loyalty, and courage as the stakes continued to rise and the convergence of power, ambition, and danger threatened to explode. In essence, Chapter 10 marked the period where Frank fully grasped immense pressures surrounding Hoffa, the Mafia, and the Teamsters. It was a time of rising tensions, calculated threats, and delicate negotiations, a period in which Frank's unique skills, loyalty, and strategic thinking were tested to their limits. His ability to maintain balance, anticipate danger, and act decisively would become critical in the dramatic events that history would later remember. and in the choices that would define both his own life and the fate of the men he served. As the 1970s advanced, the world surrounding Jimmy Hoffa became a delicate minefield where loyalty, ambition, and power intersected with lethal precision. Frank Sheeran understood better than most that the most dangerous threats were often invisible, lying in the shadows of conversations, the subtle movements of allies, and the calculated ambitions of rivals. In this world, the appearance of stability could mask the deepest dangers, and one wrong step could trigger consequences that were impossible to reverse. Frank's experience in both the Mafia and Hoffa's inner circle made him uniquely suited to detect and navigate these unseen threats. Though even he could not always predict the full extent of the dangers ahead, Frank had learned early in his career that survival depended on constant vigilance, whether on the streets, in union offices, or at political gatherings. Subtle cues could indicate betrayal, ambition, or impending conflict. A hesitant glance, an uncharacteristic tone, or a sudden change in behavior could all signal a shift in loyalty or intent. Frank's role required him to interpret these signs, act where necessary, and ensure that Hoffa remained insulated from risks that could destabilize his influence or endanger his life. The responsibility was immense, and the stakes were higher than ever. Hoffa's return to the Teamsters had reignited old rivalries. Certain officials who had gained influence during his imprisonment now viewed him as an obstacle to their ambitions. Others, aligned with organized crime, saw Hoffa's assertiveness as a threat to their carefully cultivated control. Frank's presence became crucial in navigating this volatile environment. He monitored internal politics, assessed potential threats, and ensured that Hoffa's directives were respected. Subtle interventions prevented small disputes from escalating into full-blown conflicts, demonstrating the critical importance of discretion and timing in a world where power was fragile and loyalty was conditional. The Mafia, ever watchful, maintained a quiet but constant oversight of Hoffa's actions. Leaders like Russell Bufalino understood Hoffa's brilliance and charisma, but also recognized the danger of his stubborn independence. Frank's role as mediator and enforcer required him to act as a bridge, conveying concern without escalating tensions and managing relationships in a way that preserved both Hoffa's authority and the Mafia's interests. Every move had to be calculated, every word carefully chosen, and every action measured against its potential impact. Law enforcement pressures added another layer of complexity. Investigations into union activities, financial dealings, and organized crime connections were ongoing. Frank understood that any misstep could expose vulnerabilities, trigger legal action, or undermine Hoffa's authority. He monitored interactions, guided communication strategies, and acted as a buffer between Hoffa and external pressures. His ability to anticipate risks and respond proactively allowed him to maintain stability in a landscape where scrutiny was relentless and consequences were severe. The internal dynamics of the Teamsters were equally precarious. Factions within the union jockeyed for position, seeking to expand their influence and challenge Hoffa's authority. Frank's presence ensured that these factions did not destabilize the organization. He monitored communications, observed meetings, and quietly intervened when necessary, using subtle influence rather than overt force. His actions demonstrated a keen understanding of human behavior, organizational politics, and the intricate balance of power that defined Hoffa's world. Despite the outward appearance of confidence, Hoffa himself was not immune to the pressures of these unseen threats. The constant negotiation of power, the awareness of rivals, and the burden of leadership took a toll. Frank often provided counsel, support, and a steady presence, helping Hoffa navigate the treacherous landscape without compromising his authority. Their relationship was built on trust, mutual respect, and a shared understanding of the stakes involved. Frank's loyalty and discretion became a stabilizing force in a period where uncertainty could easily lead to disaster. The nature of these threats required Frank to operate with a unique combination of patience, foresight, and adaptability. Had to recognize not only the immediate dangers but also the long-term implications of actions taken in the heat of the moment. Each decision carried consequences that extended far beyond the immediate context affecting the union, the Mafia, and the delicate balance of power that Hoffa relied upon. Frank's ability to navigate these complexities relied on his disciplined mindset honed through years of military service, Mafia operations, and close association with Hoffa. Financial influence was another tool that could be leveraged or manipulated. Hoffa's control over union funds and pension assets provided leverage in negotiations and influence over broader economic and political systems. Frank observed how these resources were used strategically, guiding decisions that balanced the union's interests with the expectations of organized crime allies. He understood that financial power could be both a shield and a weapon, and he ensured that its use reinforced stability rather than creating new vulnerabilities. In this period, Frank also recognized the importance of perception. Public appearances, political interactions, and union communications all contributed to an image of authority and control. Hoffa's visibility was both an asset and a liability, requiring careful management to prevent adversaries from exploiting perceived weaknesses. Frank's interventions often went unnoticed by the public, but they were critical in maintaining the appearance of cohesion and authority within the Teamsters and among external observers. The unseen threats Frank managed were not always external. Internal doubts, shifting loyalties, and the unpredictable ambitions of allies required constant attention. He had to anticipate potential betrayals, mediate disputes, and ensure that Hoffa's vision for the Union remained unchallenged. His ability to act decisively without drawing attention, to influence outcome, without appearing to interfere, was the hallmark of his effectiveness. The stakes were constant, the pressure relentless, and the consequences of failure absolute. As the decade progressed, Frank realized that the world surrounding Hoffa was becoming increasingly precarious. The combination of Mafia oversight, union rivalries, government scrutiny, and Hoffa's own ambition created a volatile environment in which stability was always temporary. Frank's role as protector, strategist, and silent enforcer became indispensable. His presence ensured that Hoffa could operate with confidence, that potential conflicts were diffused before escalation, and that the delicate balance of power was maintained amid constant, unseen threats. Chapter 11 marked a period of heightened awareness for Frank Sheeran. It was a time when the invisible forces shaping Hoffa's world, loyalty, ambition, and the constant threat of betrayal became ever more pronounced. Frank's ability to navigate these forces with precision, discretion, and unwavering loyalty was essential to preserving stability. In a world where trust was scarce, danger was constant, and the consequences of miscalculation could be catastrophic. In the shadow of these unseen threats, Frank remained a silent guardian, ensuring that Hoffa and the Teamsters endured in a landscape defined by risk, ambition, and the delicate balance of power. By the mid-1970s, Frank Sheeran had come to understand that loyalty was the most valuable and the most dangerous currency in Jimmy Hoffa's world. In the intricate ecosystem of the Teamsters, organized crime, and political influence, allegiance was never guaranteed. One misstep, one misinterpreted gesture, or one fractured alliance could unravel decades of carefully constructed power. Frank, with his years of experience as both soldier and enforcer, had learned to navigate this complex web with precision, ensuring that Hoffa's authority remained unchallenged and that the delicate balance of loyalty extended from union officials to mafia bosses alike. The concept of loyalty was not simple. It was layered, conditional, and often tested in the most subtle ways. Hoffa commanded respect, fear, and admiration simultaneously, and his men, Frank, foremost among them, understood that allegiance meant more than obedience. It meant anticipating his needs, mitigating threats, and sometimes making decisions without his direct input, all while maintaining the trust and confidence of both Hoffa and the Mafia. For Frank, loyalty was both a shield and a weapon, allowing him to act decisively while keeping the larger network intact. Frank observed daily how fragile this network could be. Rival union officials tested boundaries, seeking to expand their influence in the absence of overt oversight. Mafia operatives watched for opportunities to leverage Hoffa's assertiveness for their gain, while government agencies scrutinized every financial transaction, every contract, and every political alliance. In this environment, the slightest misalignment could trigger conflict, and the consequences were often irreversible. Frank's responsibility was to anticipate these fissures and act before they widened into cracks that could destroy everything Hoffa had built. One of the most challenging aspects of loyalty, Frank realized, was its dual nature. People could be outwardly compliant while harboring ambitions or grievances that threatened the organization's stability. Reading intentions, assessing behavior, and determining who could be trusted required constant vigilance. Frank relied on his intuition, honed by years of observing human behavior, in both wartime and organized crime, to identify potential threats. Subtle interactions, offhand comments, and shifts in demeanor often carried more weight than any overt declaration of allegiance. The Mafia's involvement added another layer of complexity. While Hoffa's union provided influence and resources, organized crime demanded respect, obedience, and the assurance that their interests would not be compromised. Frank, as the intermediary between these two powerful forces, had to maintain equilibrium. He delivered warnings discreetly, reassured both sides of intentions, and ensured that alliances remained stable. This required a keen understanding of human psychology, meticulous attention to detail, and the ability to act with precision while remaining invisible to those who might misinterpret his presence. Financial control was a silent but potent force in this web of loyalty. Hoffa's command over union funds, pension assets, and contract negotiations allowed him to wield influence far beyond the immediate reach of the Teamsters. Frank observed how the strategic allocation of these resources reinforced loyalty, secured political alliances, and deterred potential adversaries. Money became both a reward and a deterrent, shaping behavior and solidifying allegiance in ways that were subtle yet profoundly effective. Frank's guidance ensured that these tools were used judiciously, maintaining balance while minimizing the risk of corruption or backlash. Internal disputes within the Union presented constant challenges. Frank often found himself mediating conflicts that could have escalated into broader disruptions. His approach was always measured, subtle persuasion, calculated intervention, and a deep understanding of the human motives behind each disagreement. By addressing issues quietly and strategically, he prevented fractures that could undermine Hoffa's authority or destabilize the broader network. In this way, loyalty was both tested and reinforced, as individuals came to understand that their allegiance had tangible consequences for their standing and safety. Political pressures were equally intricate. Hoffa's influence extended into city halls, state capitals, and even Washington, D.C. Subtle shifts in policy, electoral ambitions, or public perception could alter the balance of power overnight. Frank's awareness of these dynamics allowed him to advise Hoffa on timing, negotiation, and risk management. He ensured that Hoffa could pursue his agenda without exposing vulnerabilities, navigating a world where loyalty, perception, and timing intersected with the harsh realities of power and influence. The personal dimension of loyalty also weighed heavily on Frank. He had known Hoffa for years, witnessed his triumphs and failures, and shared in both danger and success. This personal connection was inseparable from professional duty. Protecting Hoffa was both an obligation and a deeply ingrained instinct. Yet, personal loyalty required discipline, as emotion could cloud judgment in a world where precision and discretion were paramount. Frank learned to balance personal attachment with strategic action, ensuring that neither compromised the other. Even as he managed the external pressures, Frank remained acutely aware of the internal stakes. The Teamsters were a complex organism, and Hoffa's authority depended on the perception of unity, control, and unwavering loyalty. Frank's interventions, quiet, unseen, and expertly timed, reinforced this perception. His presence ensured that potential fractures were addressed before they could threaten the organization, maintaining cohesion in a world where betrayal, ambition were constant threats. Through all of this, Frank recognized a fundamental truth. Loyalty is not given, it is earned, maintained, and sometimes enforced. It is a living, dynamic force that requires attention, vigilance, and strategic foresight. One failure in judgment, one missed signal, or one lapse in discretion could unravel the careful balance of allegiance that held powerful organizations and dangerous individuals together. Frank's ability to operate within this system, balancing loyalty to Hoffa, respect for the Mafia, and awareness of political and financial realities, made him indispensable. Chapter 12 marked the period in which Frank fully understood the intricate web of loyalty surrounding Hoffa and the Teamsters. It was a world where influence was measured not only by overt power but by the subtle management of trust, discretion, and strategic action. Frank's unique skills allowed him to navigate this environment successfully, preserving stability, maintaining alliances, and ensuring that Hoffa remained unchallenged. In the shadowed corridors of power, both with organized crime and union leadership, Frank Sheeran became the silent guardian of loyalty, the unseen force that upheld authority, and the man whose precision, discretion, and unwavering commitment defined the survival of an empire built on influence, ambition, and trust. By the mid-1970s, Frank Sheeran had come to realize that his life was defined not just by loyalty and action, but by the weight of secrets he carried. In the world of Jimmy Hoffa, the Mafia, and the Teamsters, information was power, and secrecy was survival. Every conversation, every interaction, and every decision could have implications that reached far beyond the immediate moment. Frank's position as Hoffa's trusted enforcer and confidant placed him at the center of this web, making him privy to plans, fears, and ambitions that no one outside the inner circle could ever imagine. Frank understood that the burden of secrets was heavy and unrelenting. Knowledge of rivalries, betrayals, and criminal strategies could save lives or end them. The information he possessed extended beyond the Teamsters to the highest levels of organized crime and political influence. He knew that sharing even a fragment of this knowledge indiscriminately could destabilize decades of carefully maintained alliances, threaten powerful individuals, and put himself in grave danger. Every secret had to be protected, and every revelation carefully weighed against potential consequences. Hoffa's ambitions often brought secrets to the forefront. Plans for reclaiming union control, strategies for navigating political influence, and efforts to outmaneuver adversaries required discretion at every level. Frank became the repository of this sensitive information, the person who could act decisively if threats emerged while maintaining the delicate balance of trust and authority. His role was both strategic and protective. He ensured that Hoffa's vision could be executed without exposing vulnerabilities that could be exploited by rivals or investigators. The Mafia's influence added another layer of complexity to the secrecy Frank maintained. Leaders like Russell Bufalino demanded discretion, expecting Frank to navigate negotiations, warnings, and enforcement without alerting outsiders. The lives of men, the stability of organizations, and the success of operations depended on Frank's ability to carry these secrets with precision. He learned that silence was often more powerful than action, that observation could be more impactful than intervention, and that the timing of disclosure or non-disclosure was critical to preserving control. Frank also understood the psychological toll that secrets imposed. He carried knowledge that could not be shared even with those closest to him. Every relationship, every interaction, required careful calibration. He had to present loyalty without hesitation, maintain composure under pressure, and act with authority while concealing the full extent of his awareness. The weight of this duality, being simultaneously participant and observer, defined much of Frank's existence during these years. The stakes of secrecy were not limited to criminal activity or union politics. Frank had to navigate law enforcement scrutiny, media attention, and political pressures that threatened to uncover the intricate networks he helped maintain. Every document, every conversation, and every meeting had to be approached with caution. The slightest slip could lead to indictments, investigations, or violent retribution. Frank's ability to compartmentalize, think several steps ahead, and act decisively without compromising his position became essential to survival. Internal dynamics within the Teamsters often revolved around the management of secrets. Factions competed for influence, sometimes through subtle manipulation of information. Frank's role as a mediator and observer allowed him to anticipate the maneuvers, ensuring that Hoffa's authority remained unchallenged. He managed information flows, guided negotiations, and subtly redirected attention when necessary, always maintaining the illusion of unity and control. This invisible influence ensured that the Union operated efficiently while minimizing the risks posed by divided loyalties or hidden agendas. The secrecy extended to personal matters as well. Frank was privy to Hoffa's fears, ambitions, and vulnerabilities, details that could be exploited if exposed. Protecting these aspects of Hoffa's life was as critical as managing external threats. Frank's loyalty required him to internalize these burdens, ensuring that Hoffa's public image remained intact while private struggles were contained within the circle of trust. This dual responsibility demanded mental resilience, emotional control, and a deep understanding of human behavior. The weight of secrets also extended to the most dangerous of tasks, those involving violence and enforcement. Frank was often called upon to act where diplomacy failed, to intervene when threats escalated, or to execute decisions that required absolute discretion. These actions, while necessary for the preservation of power, demanded a level of moral detachment and precision that few could achieve. The consequences of failure were immediate and irreversible, reinforcing the critical importance of secrecy and strategic planning. Frank's mastery of secrecy was not merely defensive, it was also a tool of influence. By controlling what information was shared with whom and when, he shaped outcomes, prevented conflicts, and guided decisions in ways that reinforced Hoffa's authority and maintained organizational stability. This required constant assessment of the intentions of others, careful evaluation of risks, and an understanding of how perception could be manipulated to preserve loyalty and deter threats. The psychological impact of carrying these secrets was profound. Frank often reflected on the isolation inherent in his position. He could not share his knowledge freely, nor could he rely on outside validation. Every decision was made in solitude, and every miscalculation carried potential consequences for multiple lives. Yet, he embraced this burden, understanding that his role was essential to the survival of the men and organizations he served. In the shadow of these unseen forces, Frank became both a guardian and an enforcer, balancing loyalty, discretion, and authority with unwavering precision. Chapter 13 revealed the critical role that secrecy played in the life of Frank Sheeran. It was a period in which knowledge, discretion, and strategic awareness became paramount. The burden of carrying sensitive information, managing unseen threats, and guiding Hoffa's actions required extraordinary focus and resilience. Frank's ability to navigate this complex landscape, to act decisively, without revealing his full understanding, and to maintain trust in an environment rife with ambition and danger defined him as one of the most effective and indispensable figures in Hoffa's world. In essence, Frank's life during this period was defined not by visible actions, but by the careful management of secret, the silent orchestration of loyalty, and the disciplined execution of responsibilities that few could comprehend. It was a world where knowledge equaled power, discretion equaled survival, and the weight of secrets became the measure of a man's true strength. By the late 1970s, Jimmy Hoffa's world had reached a pivotal crossroads. Years of imprisonment, loyalty tests, and strategic maneuvering had shaped not only his leadership of the Teamsters but also the intricate web of alliances he relied upon. For Frank Sheeran, this was a period of unparalleled intensity. The pressures of maintaining Hoffa's authority, managing Mafia interests, and navigating a landscape of political and organizational tension had reached a peak. Every interaction, every decision, and every step forward carried consequence that could alter the course of lives, careers, and criminal empires. Hoffa's ambition remained undiminished, despite the setbacks he had endured. His vision for the Teamsters was expansive, driven by a desire not merely to regain lost influence, but to cement his legacy as one of the most powerful labor leaders in American history. Yet ambition was both a tool and a vulnerability. Hoffa's assertiveness challenged established hierarchies within the Union and threatened the delicate arrangements that the Mafia had established during his absence. Frank understood that Hoffa's drive, while formidable, could provoke retaliation, miscalculation, or unforeseen consequences if not carefully managed. Frank's role at this crossroads was as critical as ever. He had to balance Hoffa's determination with the realities of the world around him, mediating disputes, managing alliances, and intervening discreetly to prevent escalation. His experience in both organized crime and union operations gave him insight into the motivations of those around Hoffa, allowing him to anticipate reactions, mitigate risks, and ensure that ambition did not become recklessness. Frank's strategic thinking became the linchpin that held together the fragile equilibrium between loyalty, influence, and power. The Mafia's watchful presence added another layer of complexity. Leaders like Russell Bufalino valued stability and the preservation of influence, and Hoffa's ambitions occasionally threatened to upset that balance. Frank became the bridge between these competing forces, conveying concerns, managing expectations, and ensuring that negotiations remained productive, rather than confrontational. The success of these efforts depended on discretion, subtlety, and an acute awareness of timing skills Frank had honed over decades. Within the Teamsters, Hoffa faced a network of internal pressures. Some officials sought to expand their authority in his absence, while others remained loyal but cautious, waiting to see how his renewed assertiveness would manifest. Frank monitored these dynamics closely, identifying potential conflicts before they could escalate, and guiding Hoffa's interactions to reinforce loyalty and minimize resistance. Subtle interventions prevented fractures in the organization, maintaining cohesion while allowing Hoffa to pursue his ambitious goals. The intersection of ambition and risk was a constant consideration. Hoffa's desire to reclaim power brought him into contact with powerful political figures, rival union leaders, and influential business interests. Each interaction carried potential rewards, but also hidden dangers. Frank observed carefully, providing counsel and strategic guidance that allowed Hoffa to operate with confidence while minimizing exposure to threats. The balance between action and caution, aggression and diplomacy, became the defining challenge of this period. Financial influence continued to be a tool and a source of leverage. Hoffa's control over union funds and pension assets provided the means to secure loyalty, influence negotiations, and support political ambitions. Frank understood that these resources had to be deployed judiciously. Mismanagement or overreach could provoke suspicion, investigation, or even violent backlash. By guiding the strategic use of these assets, Frank reinforced Hoffa's authority while ensuring the stability of both the Union and the broader network of influence surrounding him. As Hoffa pressed forward with his agenda, the potential for conflict loomed ever larger. Rival factions, Mafia interests, and external observers were all assessing the situation, calculating their own moves in response to Hoffa's actions. Frank's awareness of these calculations allowed him to intervene preemptively, redirecting potential disputes, neutralizing threats, and maintaining a controlled environment in which Hoffa could operate. His influence, though largely invisible to outsiders, was decisive in shaping outcomes and preserving equilibrium. The personal dimension of ambition also played a role in this period. Hoffa's drive was fueled not only by organizational objectives but by a deep-seated desire for legacy and recognition. Frank, privy to the nuances of Hoffa's personality and the pressures he faced, provided both counsel and restraint. He ensured that ambition did not cloud judgment, that enthusiasm did not provoke unnecessary confrontation, that every decision was measured against the potential consequences for the Union, the Mafia, and Hoffa himself. The crossroads of ambition was further complicated by law enforcement scrutiny. Investigations into Hoffa's activities, Union operations, and Mafia connections were intensifying. Frank had to balance the pursuit of Hoffa's goals with the need for discretion, careful communication, and the management of sensitive information. Any misstep could trigger legal action, media attention, or internal disruption, making Frank's judgment and experience indispensable. His ability to anticipate threats and navigate complex, high-stakes environments ensured that Hoffa could continue to operate effectively despite these pressures. At this critical juncture, Frank also recognized the human cost of ambition. The pursuit of power, influence, and legacy was relentless, requiring sacrifices that extended beyond professional considerations. Personal relationships, trust, and the integrity of those around him were constantly tested. Frank's loyalty demanded that he bear these burdens, managing risks and making decisions that others could not understand, all while preserving the delicate balance of relationships and influence that defined Hoffa's world. Chapter 14 marked a period in which ambition and consequence converged, creating an environment of immense pressure and complex dynamics. Frank Sheeran's role at this crossroads was essential. He was the strategist, the observer, and the enforcer whose judgment and discretion maintained balance amidst uncertainty. His understanding of power, loyalty, and human behavior allowed him to navigate this period successfully, ensuring that Hoffa's drive to reclaim authority did not lead to catastrophic disruption. In essence, the late 1970s were defined by a delicate interplay of ambition, loyalty, and risk. Frank's ability to manage these forces with precision, discretion, and unwavering commitment solidified his role as the indispensable figure behind Hoffa's resurgence. The crossroads of ambition demanded not only strategic action but also foresight, restraint, and an unyielding understanding of the human and organizational dynamics at play. In this world, success depended on more than willpower. It depended on the careful orchestration of loyalty, influence, and judgment, a task that Frank Sheeran navigated with unmatched skill and unwavering loyalty. By the late 1970s, the atmosphere around Jimmy Hoffa and Frank Sheeran had grown increasingly tense. The delicate balance between union authority, Mafia influence, and political maneuvering was showing signs of strain. Hoffa's determination to reclaim his full control of the Teamsters collided with rival ambitions, both internal and external, and the consequences of this collision had the potential to be catastrophic. Frank, as always, found himself operating in the shadows, the silent enforcer and strategist, ensuring that tension did not erupt into chaos. Hoffa's presence in the Union was as magnetic as it was dangerous. His charisma commanded respect, his reputation instilled fear, and his vision for the Teamsters demanded loyalty. Yet, beneath this aura of authority, rival factions were quietly plotting, assessing opportunities to exploit perceived weaknesses. Frank understood that the external threats, while significant, were often dwarfed by internal tensions. Disloyalty, ambition, and envy within the Union had the power to destabilize Hoffa's leadership more effectively than any outside pressure. Frank's role in these months was multifaceted. He acted as Hoffa's shield, intercepting potential threats before they reached him, while simultaneously serving as a negotiator, diffusing conflicts with subtlety and precision. He had learned that overt displays of power often escalated tensions, while quiet influence and strategic intervention could neutralize threats without anyone realizing they had been addressed. This delicate balance was a hallmark of Frank's effectiveness, allowing him to maintain stability even as pressures mounted from every direction. The Mafia's interests were never far from the surface. While Hoffa's resurgence threatened certain elements of organized crime, it also presented opportunities. Frank became the conduit between Hoffa and Mafia leaders, ensuring that agreements were honored and potential conflicts mitigated. This required a profound understanding of human behavior, a keen awareness of ambition, and the ability to predict the consequences of every action. He had to navigate the unspoken rules of loyalty, respect, and power, operating with the knowledge that a single miscalculation could provoke violent consequences. Financial considerations were equally critical in this period. Hoffa's control over union funds, pensions, and negotiated contracts provided leverage that could influence not only union members but also political allies and adversaries. Frank monitored the distribution and use of these resources, ensuring that their deployment reinforced loyalty and deterred opportunism. The careful management of money was not merely a strategic tool, it was a mechanism to maintain authority, prevent fracture within the Union, and manage the expectations of external partners who were invested in the balance of power. The political climate added another layer of complexity. Hoffa's activities were closely observed by investigators, journalists, and government officials. Each public appearance, each negotiation, and each contractual decision could attract scrutiny or create leverage for rivals. Frank's awareness of these dynamics allowed him to provide counsel and intervene discreetly when necessary. He ensured that Hoffa's objectives could be pursued without exposing vulnerabilities, maintaining a protective layer around the Union leader that was both strategic and invisible. Within the Union, Frank noticed subtle shifts in loyalty and influence. Factions that had once been neutral or compliant began to test boundaries, gauging Hoffa's assertiveness and the consequences of opposition. Frank's interventions were quiet but decisive, preventing minor disputes from escalating into significant threats. He monitored conversations, assessed intentions, and guided the flow of information to ensure that allegiance remained intact. This invisible management was critical to preserving Hoffa's authority and preventing the fragmentation of the Union during a period of heightened tension. The personal dimension of conflict also weighed heavily on Frank. He was intimately aware of Hoffa's vulnerabilities, ambitions, and fears, and he carried the responsibility of protecting these aspects of the man he served. This required both discretion and courage. Decisions often had to be made without consultation, relying on Frank's judgment and understanding of human behavior. The burden of such responsibility was immense, but Frank bore it with the same discipline and calm that had characterized his life from military service through years of organized crime involvement. Violence, while not constant, was an ever-present possibility. Frank had witnessed the consequences of poorly managed disputes, both within organized crime and within union dynamics. He knew that escalation could be swift and brutal, and he acted preemptively to prevent such outcomes. The capacity to anticipate, intervene, and manage conflict quietly was a skill honed over decades, and it became central to maintaining stability during this volatile period. Every decision was calculated, every action measured, and every intervention designed to preserve balance without drawing attention to itself. The shadow of conflict extended beyond the immediate threats to include the long-term consequences of ambition and rivalry. Hoffa's determination to consolidate power and assert authority could provoke retaliation, create legal exposure, or destabilize carefully maintained alliances. Frank's strategic oversight ensured that ambition did not spiral into recklessness. He maintained a constant awareness of the broader implications of actions taken in the moment, guiding Hoffa through a landscape where every decision had ramifications that could reverberate for years. Chapter 15 highlighted the period when tension and potential conflict were at their peak. Frank Sheeran's role was critical, acting as both protector and strategist, ensuring that Hoffa could pursue his objectives while minimizing risk. His ability to navigate unseen threats, manage alliances, and maintain loyalty allowed the Union and its leader to operate in a world defined by ambition, danger, and the constant possibility of disruption. In essence, the shadow of conflict was ever present during this period. Frank's skill in managing threats, preserving stability, and guiding Hoffa through complex and dangerous circumstances defined his indispensable role. Loyalty, discretion, and strategic foresight became the pillars of his effectiveness, enabling him to maintain control in an environment where tension, ambition, and unseen threats converge with potentially devastating consequences. By the late 1970s, the tension surrounding Jimmy Hoffa and Frank Sheeran had intensified into a critical juncture, a period where careful negotiation and strategic maneuvering became paramount. Hoffa's ambition to reclaim full control of the Teamsters collided with both internal union rivalries and the complex interests of the Mafia. Frank, as always, found himself at the center of this storm, a silent enforcer, negotiator, and protector, whose judgment and discretion would shape the outcomes of events that few could comprehend. The stakes had never been higher, and every decision carried weight that extended far beyond the immediate moment. The concept of negotiation had taken on a new and complex dimension. Hoffa was determined to restore his influence, but he faced a network of adversaries who were patient, calculating, and highly skilled. Within the Teamsters, factions had emerged during Hoffa's imprisonment, each testing boundaries and challenging authority. Frank's role was to assess intentions, anticipate reactions, and ensure that conflicts could be resolved before they escalated into open confrontation. His interventions were subtle yet decisive, guiding the flow of discussions and shaping the perception of loyalty and influence. Mafia involvement added layers of complication. Leaders such as Russell Bufalino understood that Hoffa's return represented both opportunity and risk. Frank acted as the bridge between these forces, ensuring that negotiations remained productive and conflicts were mitigated before they could become violent. He had to balance loyalty to Hoffa with respect for Mafia authority, maintaining communication channels, managing expectations, and occasionally delivering warnings in ways that preserved trust on both sides. Every interaction required tact, foresight, and understanding of the unspoken rules that governed this high-stakes world. The financial leverage controlled by Hoffa played a central role in these negotiations. Union funds, pension assets, and contract arrangements were not only sources of influence but also instruments of control and persuasion. Frank carefully monitored the allocation and strategic deployment of these resources. He understood that mismanagement or overt manipulation could provoke suspicion, legal scrutiny, or backlash from both union officials and criminal associates. By guiding the prudent use of these assets, Frank ensured that Hoffa's negotiations were both effective and sustainable, reinforcing authority while minimizing risk. Political pressures also demanded careful navigation. Hoffa's visibility in labor and political circles made every negotiation subject to scrutiny. Journalists, investigators, and opponents observed every move, searching for weaknesses or opportunities to challenge his authority. Frank's awareness of these dynamics allowed him to provide guidance, anticipate challenges, and intervene when necessary to preserve both Hoffa's position and the integrity of the Teamsters. His role as a strategist extended beyond the internal organization to the broader environment in which Hoffa operated, ensuring that each decision reinforced long-term goals. Internal disputes within the union tested Frank's skills as a mediator. Leaders with divergent ambitions sought advantage, sometimes using subtle manipulation or coded communication to gain leverage. Frank's interventions often went unnoticed by those involved, yet they were critical in preventing fragmentation. He maintained loyalty to Hoffa while managing the perceptions of authority and fairness within the union. This delicate orchestration allowed Hoffa to assert control without provoking resistance or creating visible fractures that could undermine his leadership. The personal dimension of these negotiations was equally significant. Hoffa's determination, pride, and ambition could sometimes blind him to potential risks or unintended consequences. Frank's understanding of Hoffa's personality allowed him to guide decisions, tempt impulsive moves, and anticipate reactions from allies and adversaries alike. His insight into human behavior, shaped by years of military discipline and experience in organized crime, became invaluable. By subtly influencing outcomes without overt interference, Frank preserved both Hoffa's authority and the stability of the Union. Even the threat of violence loomed over every negotiation. The Mafia and rival factions could react swiftly and decisively to perceived slights or challenges. Frank had learned that preemptive intervention, subtle persuasion, and the careful management of information were often more effective than direct confrontation. He acted as a buffer, absorbing tension, redirecting potential conflicts, and ensuring that negotiations remained productive. His ability to operate invisibly yet decisively reinforced his indispensable role in Hoffa's inner circle. Time was also a critical factor. Delays, miscommunications, or perceived weakness could embolden adversaries and destabilize agreements. Frank's experience allowed him to anticipate timing, recognize strategic opportunities, and execute interventions with precision. Every decision was measured against immediate outcomes and long-term consequences, ensuring that Hoffa's objectives were achieved without compromising loyalty, stability, or influence. This strategic patience distinguished Frank from others who lacked the foresight to navigate the overlapping layers of union politics and mafia oversight. Chapter 16 marked a period in which Frank Sheeran's skill in negotiation and conflict management became pivotal. He was not merely a protector or enforcer, he was a strategist, a mediator, and the unseen force maintaining equilibrium in a world defined by ambition, danger, and competing interests. The final negotiations were about more than contracts or influence. They were about survival, authority, and the preservation of decades of power built by Hoffa and supported by Frank's unwavering loyalty. In essence, the late 1970s represented the culmination of Frank's expertise in navigating the treacherous landscape of loyalty, ambition, and authority. The final negotiations illustrated his unique ability to balance competing interests, manage complex threats, and influence outcomes without exposure or compromise. Through discretion, foresight, and strategic intervention, Frank ensured that Hoffa's ambitions could be pursued while maintaining the delicate balance of power that defined this period of history. The stakes were immense, the risks ever present, and the consequences of miscalculation potentially catastrophic. Yet, through his unwavering focus, deep understanding of human behavior, and mastery of both diplomacy and force, Frank Sheeran remained the silent guardian of Hoffa's authority. The success of these final negotiations underscored the indispensable nature of his role, as every subtle action and unseen intervention contributed to the stability, influence, and survival of one of the most powerful men in American labor history. As the late 1970s edged closer to the final chapters of Jimmy Hoffa's tumultuous career, the world surrounding him and Frank Sheeran seemed to pause in a precarious calm. It was a deceptive tranquility, the kind that settled over tense negotiations, rivalries, and hidden ambitions, giving the illusion that stability had returned. Frank understood, as he always had, that this calm was temporary, a fragile veneer over a landscape riddled with danger, intrigue, and the potential for sudden upheaval. The calm before the storm demanded vigilance, patience, and strategic foresight, all of which Frank had mastered through years of navigating the intersecting worlds of the Teamsters and organized crime. During this period, Hoffa's influence appeared to reach its zenith. His vision for the Teamsters, his relationships with key political figures, and his control over union operations projected an image of strength and invulnerability. Yet, Frank knew that appearances could be deceiving. The tension between loyalty and ambition, both within the Union and in the broader network of Mafia alliances, remained unresolved. Factions that outwardly displayed compliance often harbored ambitions or resentment that could erupt if provoked, and the Mafia's patience was not limitless. Frank's role was to ensure that this latent instability did not manifest into chaos. Frank's daily responsibilities had evolved into a delicate balancing act. He monitored potential threats, observed shifting allegiances, and maintained subtle lines of communication that allowed him to anticipate disruptions before they escalated. Every meeting, every conversation, and every public appearance was assessed for hidden implications. He had to interpret subtle gestures, coded language, and seemingly inconsequential action, understanding that the smallest sign could signal a shift in loyalty or intent. This constant awareness required a disciplined mind and an instinct, honed by years of military service and organized crime experience. Hoffa, for his part, remained both ambitious and cautious. He understood that the precarious nature of his alliances required strategic patience. His resurgence had provoked unease among rivals, and he knew that overt displays of power could trigger retaliation or legal scrutiny. Frank's counsel became essential during this period. He provided guidance on timing, measured intervention, and risk management, allowing Hoffa to assert authority while minimizing exposure to threats from within and beyond the Union. Their relationship, built on years of trust, loyalty, and shared experiences, allowed Frank to act as both protector and strategic advisor, quietly shaping outcomes from behind the scenes. The Mafia's influence remained a constant undercurrent. Leaders like Russell Bufalino had grown accustomed to Frank's mediation and strategic management, relying on him to maintain equilibrium between Hoffa's assertiveness and the interests of organized crime. Frank ensured the communications remained discreet, that grievances were addressed before escalating, and that negotiations maintained the delicate balance of power. His role was critical in preserving trust, preventing misunderstandings, sustaining the operational harmony required to avoid violent confrontation. Financial power continued to play a subtle but significant role in maintaining this calm. Hoffa's control over Union funds, pensions, and negotiated contracts allowed him to exercise influence and maintain loyalty across multiple levels of the organization. Frank monitored these resources closely, ensuring that their deployment reinforced allegiance, mitigated potential rebellion, and subtly guided behavior in ways that preserved cohesion. The careful management of money became a tool to stabilize relationships, manage risk, and maintain the appearance of order during a period of underlying tension. Internal Union dynamics were equally complex. Factions tested boundaries quietly, often through subtle maneuvers or coded signals. Frank's skill in interpreting these signals allowed him to act preemptively, diffusing conflicts before they could erupt into visible disruption. His interventions were invisible to most, yet they shaped outcomes decisively. By maintaining an unbroken chain of loyalty, Frank ensured that Hoffa's authority remained unchallenged, even when potential fractures threatened to surface. Law enforcement scrutiny added yet another layer of complexity to this calm. Investigators, journalists, and political figures closely monitored Hoffa's activities, searching for missteps that could provide leverage. Frank's awareness of these external pressures informed every recommendation he made, guiding Hoffa's actions to maintain operational security while advancing strategic goals. His ability to anticipate risks and act discreetly was instrumental in preserving both Hoffa's authority and his personal safety. The psychological dimension of this period was equally important. Frank had to maintain composure under constant pressure, bearing the weight of responsibility for multiple lives and organizations. The stress of unseen threats, unspoken ambitions, and the potential for sudden violence required mental resilience and emotional control. He had learned to compartmentalize, allowing him to act decisively while concealing the depth of his knowledge and awareness. The calm that surrounded them externally was mirrored by a state of perpetual readiness internally, a readiness to respond to threats, protect Hoffa, and preserve stability at a moment's notice. As the storm loomed ever closer, Frank's discipline and strategic foresight became more critical than ever. He continued to monitor, mediate, and manage the invisible currents of loyalty, ambition, and danger, ensuring that Hoffa could operate within the fragile equilibrium that had been maintained through decades of careful maneuvering. Every interaction, every decision, and every silent intervention contributed to the stability of the organization and the safety of its leaders. Chapter 17 highlighted the precarious calm that preceded the inevitable upheaval in Hoffa's world. Frank Sheeran's ability to manage tensions, anticipate threats, and maintain the delicate balance of power demonstrated the indispensable role he played in both protecting Hoffa and preserving the Union's cohesion. The calm before the storm was not a period of inaction. It was a time of vigilance, strategy, and quiet preparation for the challenges that were soon to arrive. In essence, Frank's presence ensured that the fragile peace of this period endured, that unseen threats were neutralized, and that Hoffa's ambitions could be pursued with a measure of security. The calm before the storm was a testament to Frank's mastery of strategy, loyalty, and human behavior, providing the foundation for the critical events that would soon shape the final chapters of Hoffa's life. In this delicate balance of tension and restraint, Frank remained the silent guardian, the unseen architect of stability, and the force that allowed Hoffa's world to persist in the shadow of looming danger. As the 1970s progressed, the delicate balance surrounding Jimmy Hoffa and Frank Sheeran began to tilt toward inevitability. The calm that had previously masked the undercurrents of danger and ambition was giving way to rising tension that permeated every layer of the Teamsters, the Mafia, and the political landscape that Hoffa navigated. Frank, ever vigilant, recognized that the period of subtle maneuvering and careful control was drawing to a close. The stakes were increasing, the threats becoming more pronounced, and the consequence of miscalculation more immediate and potentially catastrophic. Frank observed the dynamics within the Teamsters with an acute awareness that came from years of experience. Factions that had once remained compliant began to test boundaries, emboldened by Hoffa's absence from direct control and the perception that internal rivalries could be leveraged for personal gain. Frank's role required him to anticipate these moves, to neutralize threats before they could escalate, and to ensure that Hoffa's authority was never seriously undermined. This was a period where minor grievances could erupt into significant conflict, and Frank's interventions were both strategic and essential. The Mafia, ever patient but always calculating, also exerted subtle pressure. Leaders like Russell Bufalino monitored Hoffa's actions closely, assessing whether his renewed influence posed risks to their operations or opportunities for leverage. Frank acted as the intermediary, managing communication, preventing misunderstandings, and maintaining a fragile equilibrium. He understood that the slightest misstep could provoke retaliation, and that the balance of power was both delicate and dynamic. Every interaction required judgment, foresight, and an understanding of both human psychology and the unspoken codes that governed organized crime. Financial influence continued to be a key instrument of power. Hoffa's control over union funds, pension plans, and negotiated contract provided leverage that extended far beyond the Teamsters themselves. Frank monitored the strategic use of these resources, ensuring that allocations reinforced loyalty, rewarded compliance, and subtly influenced behavior in ways that maintained stability. Mismanagement or overreach could easily ignite conflict, attract scrutiny, or provoke suspicion, and Frank, as guidance, ensured that these tools remained both effective and discreet. Political pressures added another dimension to the rising tensions. Hoffa's prominence made him a target for investigative scrutiny, media attention, and political maneuvering. Every action he took was evaluated not only by adversaries, but also by law enforcement and journalists searching for inconsistencies or vulnerabilities. Frank's role in navigating these pressures was critical. He advised on timing, communication, and strategic discretion, ensuring that Hoffa could operate effectively without compromising his position or inviting unnecessary exposure. Within the Teamsters, the internal landscape was becoming increasingly complex. Loyalty was no longer a guarantee. Ambitions that had been suppressed during Hoffa's imprisonment were now emerging with renewed vigor. Frank's interventions were subtle yet decisive, preventing minor disputes from escalating into fractures that could destabilize the Union. By maintaining the perception of cohesion, he preserved Hoffa's authority while quietly neutralizing potential threats. His understanding of organizational dynamics, human behavior, and the subtleties of power allowed him to operate effectively without drawing attention to his influence. The psychological toll of these rising tensions was considerable. Frank carried knowledge that could not be shared freely, understanding that disclosure could endanger lives or compromise alliances. The constant vigilance required to monitor threats, anticipate conflicts, and guide outcomes created a weighty burden. Yet Frank embraced this responsibility, recognizing that his ability to manage tension and maintain loyalty was indispensable to both Hoffa and the broader network of influence surrounding him. Violence remained an ever-present possibility. Past experiences had taught Frank that disputes, if poorly managed, could escalate rapidly into physical confrontations with lethal consequences. He monitored the subtle signs of unrest, gestures, coded messages, and changes in demeanor, intervening preemptively to prevent escalation. His capacity to neutralize potential conflicts quietly and decisively was essential to preserving stability during this volatile period. Every action he took was calculated to maintain order without provoking suspicion or retaliation. The rising tensions were not limited to organizational dynamics, they extended to personal relationships and the moral complexities inherent in Frank's role. He had to navigate loyalty to Hoffa, respect for Mafia protocols, and the personal ethic of managing situations that often involved violence, deception, and betrayal. This required a delicate balance of emotional control, strategic thinking, and unflinching discipline. The decisions he made affected not only his own fate but the stability of Hoffa, the Teamsters, and the intricate network of alliances upon which power rested. As Chapter 18 unfolded, the sense of impending change became palpable. Frank recognized that the period of subtle negotiation and controlled tension was drawing to a close. The convergence of ambition, loyalty, and external pressures was creating a volatile environment in which small actions could have outsized consequences. His vigilance, judgment, and strategic intervention were more critical than ever. The stakes were immense: the future of the Teamsters, the stability of Mafia alliances, and the safety of those around Hoffa depended on Frank's ability to manage these rising tensions with precision. In essence, this chapter marked the transition from relative calm to an environment defined by uncertainty and potential conflict. Frank Sheeran's mastery of strategy, loyalty, and human behavior allowed him to navigate these rising tensions successfully, maintaining authority, preventing fractures, and preserving the delicate equilibrium upon which Hoffa's world depended. Every observation, every decision, and every subtle intervention contributed to the continued survival of one of the most powerful men in American labor history. The rising tensions of Chapter 18 served as a reminder that power, influence, and loyalty are never static. They are dynamic forces, constantly tested by ambition, scrutiny, and human desire. Frank's ability to maintain control, anticipate threats, and act decisively in the shadows demonstrated why he was indispensable to Hoffa. The storm was approaching, but through vigilance, discipline, and quiet authority, Frank Sheeran ensured that when it arrived, Hoffa and the Teamsters would be as prepared as they could be in a world where the balance of power was always fragile, and the consequences of miscalculation potentially irreversible. By the early 1980s, the world that Jimmy Hoffa and Frank Sheeran had navigated for decades was reaching a defining conclusion. The networks of loyalty, power, and influence that had shaped the Teamsters, the Mafia, and American labor were under strain. Hoffa's relentless ambition, once a source of unstoppable authority, was now tempered by threats, uncertainty, and the relentless scrutiny of law enforcement. Frank Sheeran, as always, remained at the center, a silent guardian, enforcer, and strategist whose decisions and actions had defined the outcomes of events that few could ever fully understand. The end of this era was approaching, and its implications would reverberate far beyond the immediate world of unions and organized crime. The final years of Hoffa's life were marked by increasing tension and isolation. Despite efforts to reassert control over the Teamsters, his every move was observed, calculated, and challenged. Rival factions within the union waited for opportunities, while the Mafia assessed the balance of power and their own interests with careful attention. Frank understood that the equilibrium that had been maintained through decades of strategy, loyalty, and subtle intervention was now fragile. Every conversation, every meeting, and every decision carried unprecedented weight. Frank's role during this period was both protective and managerial. He had to ensure Hoffa's safety while navigating a complex web of relationships, ambitions, and threats. The Teamsters remained a volatile environment where alliances shifted quickly and ambitions ran high. Frank's interventions were subtle yet decisive. A quiet word here, a preemptive action there, designed to preserve loyalty, prevent escalation, and maintain the image of authority that Hoffa needed to project. His ability to operate invisibly yet influence outcomes profoundly was more crucial than ever. The Mafia's oversight during this period was constant. Leaders like Russell Bufalino had long relied on Frank's discretion, judgment, and skill in managing both Hoffa and the union's internal dynamics. They expected results without exposure, compliance without confrontation. Frank's ability to balance these expectations, mediate disputes, and manage loyalty ensured that the fragile equilibrium endured. Every interaction with organized crime required careful calibration, as even minor miscalculations could trigger retaliation or destabilize long-standing alliances. Financial and political considerations continued to shape Hoffa's environment. Union funds, pension assets, and negotiated contracts remained tools of influence and control. Frank monitored these resources meticulously, guiding their strategic use to maintain loyalty, reward compliance, and subtly influence behavior. Simultaneously, political observers, law enforcement, and journalists scrutinized every action, adding pressure to an already volatile environment. Frank's guidance allowed Hoffa to navigate these challenges, preserving both operational effectiveness and personal safety. The personal dynamics of loyalty and trust were equally significant. Frank had witnessed Hoffa's rise, imprisonment, resurgence, and the constant pressures that accompanied leadership of a powerful organization. Their relationship had evolved into one defined by mutual understanding, loyalty, and necessity. Frank carried knowledge, responsibility, and burdens that could never be shared. shaping outcomes while remaining unseen. The weight of these responsibilities was immense, yet he bore it with unwavering discipline, understanding that the survival of Hoffa and the stability of the Teamsters depended on his judgment. As events progressed, the inevitability of change became clearer. Hoffa's presence was both a source of power and a potential trigger for conflict. Factions within the Union were growing impatient, the Mafia remained vigilant, and the scrutiny of authorities increased. Frank recognized that the world they had navigated for decades was shifting irreversibly. The strategies, interventions, and measures that had preserved stability were now being tested against forces that could no longer be controlled entirely. The tension that had been rising over years was reaching a critical point. Despite the pressure, Frank remained focused and disciplined. He continued to mediate internal disputes, manage the flow of information, and anticipate potential threats. His strategic interventions were designed to maintain order, protect Hoffa, and guide events toward the most favorable outcomes possible under increasingly difficult circumstances. Each decision was weighed against immediate consequences and long-term ramifications, with careful attention to both human behavior and organizational dynamics. The period also revealed the profound consequences of ambition, loyalty, and secrecy. Hoffa's relentless drive, the loyalty of those around him, and the secrets that Frank carried had shaped outcomes for decades. Now, as the end of this era approached, these same forces defined the final moments. Loyalty could protect, but it could also expose. Ambition could achieve greatness, but it could also provoke downfall. Secrecy could preserve life, yet conceal danger. Frank understood that these forces, managed carefully over time, were now interacting in ways beyond his control, marking a turning point in history. Chapter 19, the final chapter in this long narrative, underscored the culmination of decades of strategy, loyalty, and intervention. Frank Sheeran's role as protector, enforcer, and strategist had been indispensable in preserving Hoffa's authority and the stability of the Teamsters. Yet, the shifting tides of ambition, scrutiny, and organizational dynamics reminded him that even the most carefully managed networks were vulnerable to forces beyond human control. The end of an era was not defined by a single moment, but by the cumulative effect of decisions, actions, and relationships over decades. In essence, the story of Hoffa and Frank Sheeran concluded not with dramatic revelation alone, but with the acknowledgement of the intricate interplay of loyalty, strategy, and human ambition. Frank's presence had shaped events, preserved lives, and maintained balance, ensuring that Hoffa's vision endured longer than might have been possible otherwise. The end of this era marked both the culmination of a remarkable life intertwined with power and influence, and the transition into a history defined by memory, legacy, and the consequences of choices made in the shadows. Ultimately, the final chapter highlighted the extraordinary skill, discipline, and unwavering commitment that defined Frank Sheeran's role. Through decades of negotiation, enforcement, and silent intervention, he had maintained stability in a world dominated by ambition, rivalry, and constant threat. The end of an era was not simply a conclusion. It was the testament to a life shaped by loyalty, discretion, and the extraordinary ability to navigate the complex, dangerous, and unpredictable world that Jimmy Hoffa inhabited, a world in which Frank Sheeran remained the invisible force that preserved it all until the very end.